Ahmad stood in front of the small bathroom mirror, the steam from the porcelain basin beginning to cloud the glass. He took a slow breath, adjusting the stiff collar of his white wedding shirt. Outside the door, the muffled chaos of 50 relatives filled the hallway with the smell of jasmine and spice. He reached for the wooden bolt, slid it home, and turned on the tap. Hello, everyone. Today we're looking at 13 cases from across the globe that prove the most terrifying things happen when everything seems perfectly normal. This is our latest episode, featuring 13 stories of the strange, dark, and mysterious. If you enjoy this kind of storytelling, please subscribe and let me know in the comments where in the world you're watching from tonight. Before we dive in, if you could gently reach out and lock the like button in a small, windowless bathroom and then vanish without a trace, that would be greatly appreciated. It's a little strange, I know, but it really helps the channel. Just make sure the door is bolted from the inside before you leave it there forever. It'll understand. Probably. Now, let's get back to the story. The morning of June 11th, 1976, in the city of Ipoh, was heavy with the kind of humidity that makes your clothes feel like they are part of your skin. Inside the Sahara family home, the air was thick with the scent of jasmine flowers and the rich, fatty aroma of beef rendang simmering in massive pots out in the back kitchen. It was the day of the wedding. Ahmad Sharif was 26 years old. In his community, he was the person everyone looked to when they needed a calm head. He was a primary school teacher, a man who spent his days explaining the world to children with a patience that seemed bottomless. He was not a man given to flights of fancy or sudden, impulsive decisions. He was the anchor of his family. On this morning, the house was a labyrinth of people. Cousins were running through the hallways. Aunts were fussing over the silk drapes, and the sound of laughter was constant. Ahmad had spent the early hours greeting guests, his smile steady and genuine. But as the clock neared 10 in the morning, his mother nudged him toward the back of the house to get ready. The bathroom in the Sharif home was a simple, functional space. It was located at the end of a narrow corridor, tucked away from the main living area. It was a wet room style, typical of the era, with smooth cement floors and a large porcelain basin filled with cool water. There was only one way in and one way out, a heavy wooden door with a thick iron bolt. Ahmad entered the room and closed the door behind him. The noise of the wedding preparations immediately dropped to a dull, rhythmic thrum. He looked at his reflection in the small, rectangular mirror. He felt a quiet, profound sense of arrival. He thought to herself, everything is finally exactly where it belongs. It was the last clear thought he would ever record. He reached out and slid the iron bolt into place. The sound was a sharp, metallic thud that signaled his few minutes of privacy. He turned the brass tap over the basin. The water began to flow, a steady, splashing sound that masked the noise of the 50 people, celebrating just 30 feet away. He began to lather his face, preparing for one final shave before the ceremony. Outside, the wedding machine continued to grind. His fiancée was in another part of town, being dressed in traditional lace, surrounded by her own swarm of relatives. The groom's party was scheduled to leave in less than an hour. In the hallway, Ahmad's younger brother walked past the bathroom door, hearing the steady, splashing rhythm of the running water. 10 minutes passed, then 15. The splashing water never stopped, and it never changed its tone. In a house where every second was being managed by a dozen different ants, 15 minutes was a long time to spend in the bathroom. One of Ahmad's cousins knocked lightly on the wood. He joked that the groom was probably having second thoughts and should hurry up. There was no answer from inside. The cousin knocked again, louder this time. The only sound coming from the room was the relentless, empty splash of the tap hitting the porcelain basin. The air in the hallway began to feel a little cooler. Or perhaps it was just the sudden silence that began to radiate outward from the bathroom door as the relatives stopped talking. By 20 minutes, the joking had stopped entirely. Ahmad's father was called over. He pounded on the door with the side of his fist, calling his son's name. He put his ear to the wood, He could hear the water. He could hear it hitting the floor now, meaning the basin was overflowing. But he couldn't hear breathing. He couldn't hear the sound of a towel or a glass. Imagine you are standing in that narrow hallway. The heat is pressing against your chest, and the smell of jasmine is so strong it feels cloying, almost like it's trying to choke you. You are looking at a door that you know is locked from the inside. You can see the water beginning to seep under the frame, cool and clear, soaking into the rug at your feet. The pressure in the hallway became physical. 3 of the men lined up, their shoulders squared. On the count of 3, they lunged forward. The wood groaned, but the iron bolt held. They hit it again, harder this time, the sound echoing through the house like a gunshot. On the 3rd strike, the frame splintered, and the door swung inward, hitting the interior wall. The men rushed into the small space, their feet splashing into 2 inches of standing water. They immediately reached for the tap to kill the noise, and the silence that followed was deafening. They looked toward the mirror, then the corner where the towels hung, then the floor. The bathroom was completely empty. There was no one there. The first thing they checked was the window. It was a small, rectangular opening high up on the wall, barely wide enough for a child to squeeze through. It was covered by a permanent metal grate, and more importantly, the latch was still firmly closed from the inside. There were no scuff marks on the walls. There was no blood. There was nothing. The search that followed was a frantic, disorganized explosion of energy. They tore up the floorboards in the hallway. They climbed into the crawl space above the ceiling. They ran out into the yard, calling Ahmad's name into the humid afternoon air. 50 people had been in and around that house, and not one of them had seen Ahmad leave that narrow corridor. The police arrived within the hour, but they were just as baffled. They checked the plumbing, thinking perhaps he had somehow fallen into a void they couldn't see. But the pipes were narrow and standard. They interviewed every guest. Every exit to the house had been manned by people preparing food or greeting arrivals. No one had seen the groom. As the sun began to set on what was supposed to be his wedding day, the atmosphere in Ipoh shifted from panic to a deep, hollow dread. Local shamans were brought in, men who spoke of forest spirits and hidden folds in the world. They walked through the bathroom with incense, but the smoke only rose straight up into the stagnant, humid air. Ahmad's fiancée never took off her wedding dress that night. She sat in the front room of her family home, her eyes fixed on the door. She would end up staying in that house for the next 50 years, never marrying, never moving on. She became a living extension of the mystery, a person whose entire life was defined by a 30-minute gap in 1976. The case of the missing groom became a dark legend in Perak. Investigators returned to the house dozens of times over the following decades, looking for hidden compartments or signs of a sophisticated kidnapping. But the logic always failed. To kidnap a man from a locked bathroom in a house full of people without making a sound is a physical impossibility. Today, the house where Ahmad vanished still stands. It has become a landmark for those who study the unexplained, a place where the air still feels a little too heavy and the silence in the back hallway feels a little too deliberate. People still walk past that bathroom door and feel a chill, wondering how a man can simply uncouple himself from reality. That was 50 years ago. To this day, not a single trace of Ahmad Siarif has ever been found. No body, no clothing, no explanation. He simply walked into a room, slid a bolt, and stepped out of time entirely. It serves as a reminder that the walls of our reality might be much thinner than we like to believe, especially when we are alone. On the other side of the Indian Ocean, the heat was just as heavy. But the silence didn't come from a locked room. It came from the endless dunes of the Sahara, in the vast, shifting sands of the desert. A different kind of disappearance was about to unfold, one that would leave behind a scene far more expansive and just as silent. Jean-Luc tapped the glass of the radio frequency dial with the pad of his index finger. A rhythmic, Hollow sound that was the only thing competing with the low whistle of the wind outside. The needle didn't move. He adjusted his glasses, his skin slick with a mixture of sweat and fine, pulverized dust that seemed to find its way through every seal of the Land Rover. He looked out the windshield at the horizon, where the orange dunes of the Algerian-Morocco border met a sky so blue it looked almost black. It was midday. The sun was a white-hot weight, and for the first time in 3 weeks of surveying, the radio was dead. The year was 1976. Jean-Luc was part of a 4-man geological team, a mix of French and Algerian scientists who were used to the harsh, mathematical reality of the Sahara. They weren't tourists or thrill-seekers. They were men who calculated their lives in liters of water and kilometers of fuel. Their mission was a routine survey of the remote border regions, a place where the landscape shifted so often that maps were mostly just polite suggestions. In this part of the world, you followed the rocks, not the roads. The team consisted of Jean-Luc, the senior geologist, Malik, a specialist in mineralogy who knew the desert like the back of his hand, and 2 younger assistants, Pierre and Said. They were a tight unit, disciplined and predictable, every day at exactly 12 noon and 6 in the evening. They were required to check in with the base camp at Tindouf. It was a lifeline, a thin thread of sound that connected them to the rest of the civilized world. If that thread snapped, the desert became a very large, very indifferent cage. The geologists were driving a specially outfitted 1975 Land Rover Series 3, a machine built for the impossible. It carried enough supplies for a month, including 300 liters of water, spare parts, and enough canned food to sustain them through a sandstorm. They were professionals. They didn't take risks. They knew that in the Sahara, a single mistake didn't just cause a delay, it caused a disappearance. They were currently operating in a sensitive geopolitical zone, a region where the border was a point of contention between nations. But for the geologists, the only authority that mattered was the sun. At the base camp in Tindouf, the radio operator, a man named Henry, sat in a humid, corrugated metal shack. He checked his watch. It was 12:05. He adjusted his headset and sent out the call sign for the survey team. Static was the only reply. He wasn't worried yet. The Sahara is famous for atmospheric interference, and skip distance issues were common during the heat of the day. He waited 10 minutes and tried again. Still nothing. By 2 in the afternoon, Henri alerted the local military attaché. By 6 in the evening, when the second check-in window passed in total silence, the alert level moved from concern to crisis. The search was launched at dawn the following morning. The Algerian military provided 2 helicopters and a ground team in high-clearance vehicles. They had the geologists' last known coordinates, a point deep in the dunes near the border. The searchers moved with a sense of urgency that was dampened by the sheer scale of the environment. The Sahara is not just a place, it is a physical pressure that works against you. The heat distorts your vision, making the horizon ripple like a mirage. And the silence is so heavy, it feels like it is pressing against your eardrums. On the 3rd day of the search, a pilot named Captain Amine spotted something reflecting light about 40 kilometers east of the original survey path. As he brought the helicopter lower, the shape of the Land Rover emerged from the orange haze. It was sitting perfectly upright in a flat expanse between 2 massive dunes. From the air, it looked like a toy left in a sandbox. There were no signs of fire, no smoke, and most importantly, no people standing nearby waving for help. The vehicle was just sitting there, solitary and still. The ground team reached the site 4 hours later. As the vehicles approached, the soldiers held their breath, expecting to see the grisly aftermath of a mechanical failure or a dehydration-fueled tragedy. But as they pulled alongside the Land Rover, the scene they encountered was much stranger. The car was in perfect condition. The tires were properly inflated. There was no sand piled up against the chassis, meaning it hadn't been sitting there for more than a few days. The keys were still in the ignition, and the fuel tank was nearly 3/4 full. The searchers fanned out around the vehicle. About 20 meters away, they found the camp. 2 tents had been pitched with professional precision. The guy lines taut and the stakes driven deep into the hard-packed sand beneath the surface layer of silt. Inside the first tent, the geologists' sleeping bags were rolled out, ready for use. Their personal kits, shaving gear, extra clothes, books were neatly organized. There was no sign of a struggle. In the torn fabric, no spilled water, no blood. It looked like the men had simply stepped out for a moment and intended to be right back. The most unsettling detail was found on a small folding table set up between the tents. On it sat 4 tin plates and 4 cups. There was food on the plates, dried meat and bread that had become hard and brittle in the sun. But it hadn't been finished. A jar of jam was open, a spoon still resting inside it. It was a Mary Celeste of the desert. The scene was so domestic, so normal, that it felt violent in its stillness. The geologists hadn't fled from anything. They had been in the middle of a meal. Captain Amin walked to the edge of the camp and looked out at the dunes. He thought to himself, the desert doesn't hide things, it consumes them. He looked for footprints. In the Sahara, the wind is a constant gardener, smoothing over the sand every few hours. But around the camp, the sand was undisturbed. There were no tracks leading away from the tents. There were no footprints from a group of attackers. There were no marks of a vehicle coming or going, other than the geologists' own tire tracks, which stopped abruptly where the Land Rover was parked. The search party spent the next 48 hours scouring every square meter of the surrounding area. They used thermal imaging from the air and moved in lines on the ground. They found nothing. No clothing, no equipment, and no bodies. The 4 men had vanished into thin air. The military checked with the border patrols of both Algeria and Morocco, thinking perhaps the team had been detained for trespassing into a restricted zone, but both sides denied any contact. In 1976, the region was a tinderbox, and a kidnapping of French nationals would have been a major political incident. No ransom was ever demanded. No group claimed responsibility. The pressure of the silence began to act on the searchers. In the desert, sound behaves strangely. When you are alone in the dunes, you can hear the sand trickling down the face of a slope. A dry, hissing sound that vibrates in your very bones. If you stand perfectly still, you can hear your own heartbeat echoing in your inner ears. The searchers began to feel that the environment was closing in on them, that the vastness was not empty, but filled with something they couldn't see. The sound of the wind through the Land Rover's open windows sounded like a low, mournful sigh that never stopped. A nomadic guide from a local Tuareg tribe was brought in to assist the military. He was an old man whose face was a map of every sun-bleached mile he had traveled. He walked through the abandoned camp. His eyes narrowed against the glare. He didn't look at the table or the tents. He looked at the sky. He told the soldiers that the night before the geologists went silent, he had seen strange lights on the horizon, not stars, and not the headlights of a car. They were lights that moved with a cold, blue rhythm, hovering over the dunes before vanishing into the blackness. The soldiers dismissed it as superstition, but the guide refused to stay near the camp after sunset. The military's final report was a masterpiece of ambiguity. It concluded that the 4 geologists had likely become disoriented and wandered into the desert during a localized sandstorm, despite the fact that their supplies were full and their camp was perfectly intact. The report ignored the open jam jar and the unrolled sleeping bags. It ignored the fact that seasoned professionals don't wander into the dunes without water during a meal. The case was quietly filed away, a casualty of the difficult terrain and the political sensitivities of the border. But the families of the men never accepted the official version. To them, the Ghost Convoy was not an accident, it was a removal. They pointed to the absolute lack of physical evidence as proof of a high-level intervention. Whether it was a covert military unit performing a clean sweep of a sensitive area or something even more inexplicable, the result was the same. 4 lives had been erased, leaving behind only the haunting image of a table set for 4 in the middle of a wasteland where no human should have been. 50 years later, The Sahara still keeps its secret. In 2026, a private expedition using high-resolution satellite technology began rescanning that specific sector of the border. They aren't looking for footprints anymore. They are looking for metal fragments of watches, belt buckles, or tools buried deep under the shifting orange mountains of sand. The technology can peer through meters of silt, but the desert is a vast, moving ocean. What was at the surface in 1976 could now be buried under 100 feet of ancient dust. The after effect of the story isn't the mystery of where they went, but the chilling realization of how quickly the world can reset itself. One moment, there is the sound of a spoon in a jam jar and the murmur of colleagues sharing a meal. The next, there is only the sound of the wind and the slow, inevitable trickle of sand against a car door. The desert doesn't need to kill you to make you disappear. It just needs to wait for you to look away. Sometimes, the most terrifying void isn't a desert thousands of miles away. It is the moment you realize someone has been watching your own front door. In the quiet suburbs of a city where every street is mapped and every house is a fortress, the feeling of safety can be shattered by a single mark left in the dark. In the next case, the threat didn't come from the vastness of nature, but from a silent intruder who turned a home into a hunting ground. Jacob van der Merwe stood in the hallway of his home in the eastern suburbs of Pretoria, his fingers stained with the faint metallic scent of clock oil. He reached into the belly of the towering mahogany grandfather clock, grasping the heavy brass key. It was 10 o'clock on a Tuesday night in mid-1976. He began the slow, rhythmic winding, the internal gears clicking with a mechanical certainty that Jacob found deeply comforting. Outside, the South African night was cooling, the dry air carrying the scent of eucalyptus and distant wood smoke. He finished his task, closed the glass door of the clock, and checked the deadbolt on his front entrance one last time. In 1976, the suburbs of Pretoria were places of quiet, manicured lawns and high brick walls. People here lived by a code of domestic security that bordered on the religious. They had heavy iron gates, thick wooden doors made of solid teak or oak, and windows barred with ornate steel. There was a sense that if you simply stayed inside and turned the key, the world outside could not reach you. It was a brittle kind of safety, built on the belief that a lock was a physical barrier that a human intent could not cross. The residents of these suburbs were mostly professionals, elderly couples, and families who valued their privacy above all else. The next morning, Jacob walked out to his driveway to retrieve the newspaper. As he turned back toward his house, something caught the light on the dark wood of his front door. He stepped closer, his brow furrowed. There, at eye level, someone had used a sharp instrument to carve a deep, jagged X into the grain. The wood had been splintered, revealing the pale, raw fibers beneath the dark stain. It was about 4 inches wide. Jacob ran his thumb over it, feeling the sharp edges. There were no footprints in the flower beds, and the gate was still locked. He felt a strange, cold prickle at the base of his neck. It wasn't just vandalism, it felt like a signature. He didn't know it yet, but he was one of the lucky ones. Across the suburbs of Pretoria, this mark was appearing on doors with a terrifying regularity. Sometimes it was on the front door, sometimes the back, and sometimes it was found on the interior bedroom door of a house that had been completely locked from the inside. The police were initially dismissive, treating it as a prank by local teenagers. But then, the first bodies were found. An elderly couple in the suburb of Waterkloof had been murdered in their sleep. There was no sign of forced entry, no broken glass, and no missing valuables. The only thing left behind was a heavy miner's axe resting on the kitchen table and a fresh X carved into their bedroom door. The Pretoria Axeman, as the press began to call him, was a ghost that moved through solid walls. The fear in the city began to take on a physical weight. People stopped going out after dark. They spent thousands of rands on additional security, adding bars to chimneys and reinforcing floorboards. But the Axeman didn't seem to care about the new locks. He was a predator who understood the architecture of these homes better than the people who lived in them. He knew which floorboards creaked and which window latches could be vibrated loose from the outside. He was methodical, patient, and completely silent. The pressure in the community reached a breaking point by the summer of 1977. The killings were sporadic but brutal. The victims were always found in their beds, their lives taken with a single, heavy blow. There was never a struggle. It was as if the killer had materialized in the corner of the room, performed his grim task, and vanished back into the night. The police were baffled by the lack of physical evidence. No fingerprints were ever found on the axes, which were always left at the scene. It was a taunt. He was telling them that the weapon didn't matter. The fact that he could get to them was the point. The most chilling aspect was the devil's mark. For the victims, the carving of the X was the final ritual. In several cases, neighbors reported hearing a faint, rhythmic scratching sound in the middle of the night, like a large insect burrowing into wood. They had ignored it, thinking it was just the house settling in the cooling night air. By the time they woke up, the person next door was gone. The realization that the killer was spending minutes, perhaps even half an hour, meticulously carving a symbol into a door while his victims slept just inches away, was a level of psychological cruelty that the city couldn't comprehend. Imagine you are lying in your bed in the dead of night. The house is perfectly still, and the only sound is the rhythmic ticking of a clock in the hallway. You have checked the doors 3 times. You have locked the windows. You feel safe. But then, you hear a sound so thin and sharp it barely registers. It is the sound of steel sliding through the air. You don't see a shadow, and you don't hear a footstep. You only feel the sudden, heavy displacement of the air as something moves toward you in the dark. It is the sound of a predator who has already won, and there is no way back to the world of the living. In that moment of absolute stillness, a victim named Thomas Miller had a single, crystal clear thought: I hope I didn't forget to lock the back door. It was a mundane, practical thought that tried to anchor him to a reality that was already dissolving. He reached for the lamp on his bedside table, his fingers brushing the cold metal, but he never turned it on. The Axeman was already there, a silhouette standing in the doorway where the fresh X had just been carved. The silence in the room was not empty. It was filled with the intruder's steady, calm breathing, a sound that felt like it was being inhaled directly from the victim's own lungs. The sound of the axe was not a loud crash. It was a low, heavy whistle as the iron head cut through the darkness. It was a sound that acted on the body like a physical blow, even before it made contact. It made the teeth ache and the spine go rigid. The Axeman didn't swing with rage. He swung with the calculated force of a man splitting a log. The impact was swallowed by the mattress and the heavy blankets, leaving only the sound of the wind sighing through the open window the killer used to exit. He moved with the grace of a shadow, leaving the heavy, blood-stained tool behind like a discarded thought. As the body count rose to 4 confirmed victims, a prominent private investigator named Leon Pelzer claimed he had found a common link between the houses. He told his colleagues that the Axeman wasn't choosing victims at random. He was targeting people who had recently had work done on their homes: plumbing, electrical repairs, or roof work. Pelzer believed the killer was a tradesman who had spent time inside these houses, mapping the layouts and identifying the weak points in the security. He scheduled a meeting with the Pretoria police to hand over his findings. He never made it to that meeting. Pelzer vanished on a Tuesday evening. The same day of the week, Jacob van der Merwe had found the first mark on his door. Pelzer's car was found idling on a quiet side street with the driver's side door wide open. His briefcase was still in the passenger seat, filled with his notes and diagrams. There was no sign of a struggle, and no blood was found in the car. It was as if he had simply stepped out of his vehicle and into another dimension. His disappearance sent a fresh wave of panic through the police department. If a trained investigator could be taken so easily, what hope did an ordinary citizen have? The killings stopped as abruptly as they had begun. In late 1977, the waning moon rose over Pretoria, But no more marks appeared on the doors. No more axes were left on kitchen tables. The city remained in a state of high alert for months, waiting for the other shoe to drop. But the Axeman had simply moved on. Some believed he had died in an accident. Others thought he had been arrested for a different, unrelated crime. But the most unsettling theory was that he had simply finished what he set out to do. He had proven that the locks didn't work. And once the point was made, he had no reason to stay. The Pretoria police kept the case files open for decades. But the trail had gone cold the moment Pelzer disappeared. The evidence was moved to the National Criminal Museum, where the axes sit today in a glass-fronted cabinet. They are ordinary tools, heavy, rusted, and unremarkable. But to anyone who lived in Pretoria in the mid-70s, they are symbols of a time when the home was no longer a sanctuary. The museum guards say that even now, visitors will stand in front of that cabinet and instinctively reach for their own necks, feeling the phantom pressure of a shadow standing in a doorway. The after effect of the Pretoria Axeman is a lingering distrust of the very things that are supposed to keep us safe. It is the reason people in those suburbs still check their doors 4 or 5 times before bed. It is the reason a simple scratch on a wooden frame can cause a heart to skip a beat. The Axeman didn't just take lives, he took the illusion of privacy. He left behind a city of people who know that a lock is only as strong as the person on the other side of it. And sometimes, the person on the other side is already inside with you. A heavy iron axe leaves a mark that never fades. But in Lyon, the only thing left behind was a piece of clothing that looked like it had never been worn. The metallic weight of the Pretoria murders felt grounded in the cold reality of a weapon. Yet in a crowded French street, a disappearance would occur that felt even more impossible because it left behind a garment that was perfectly clean, as if the person inside it had simply evaporated into the spring air. Marie-Agnès stood on the threshold of the apartment building, her small palm open to the cool spring air of Lyon. In the center of her hand sat 3 copper coins, the metal cold and smelling faintly of vinegar against her skin. It was Sunday, the 20th of April, 1975. She closed her fingers over the money, feeling the hard edges of the coins press into her palm. She adjusted the hem of her pink floral dress, a garment her mother had ironed just that morning, and stepped out onto the sidewalk. The street was busy with the Sunday rush, a sea of overcoats and the smell of roasting coffee from a nearby cafe. She had 300 meters to walk to the corner newsstand. It was a route she had taken 100 times, a simple errand that should have taken exactly 3 minutes. Marie-Agnès Accra was 12 years old, but she carried herself with the quiet, deliberate caution of someone much older. She was a shy girl, the kind of child who preferred the company of her books to the loud, unpredictable games of the other children in the neighborhood. She was intensely obedient, a girl who understood the value of a promise and the weight of a parent's trust. On this afternoon, she was wearing her favorite dress, the small pink flowers vibrant against the gray stone of the city. She didn't run, and she didn't dawdle. She walked with her head slightly down, her eyes focused on the pavement, counting the cracks between the stones to pass the time. She was a small, bright point of color moving through the muted tones of a French afternoon. A girl who believed that if she followed the rules, the world would remain a safe place. The newsstand sat on the corner of a bustling intersection, a small green kiosk surrounded by stacks of the Sunday editions of Le Progrès. The walk from her front door to that kiosk was a straight line, visible for most of its length from the upper windows of her family's apartment. Her mother had watched her for the first 50 meters, seeing the pink of her dress bobbing through the crowd before turning back to the kitchen to finish the afternoon meal. It was a neighborhood where everyone knew everyone else, or at least they thought they did. There were bakers, tailors, and elderly couples taking their afternoon promenade. It was a place where a 12-year-old girl should have been invisible in her safety. But at 10 minutes past 3, the 3-minute walk had stretched into 10. The coins remained squeezed in her hand, the metal growing warm from her grip. Inside the apartment, the silence began to take on a sharp, jagged edge. Her father, a man who measured his life by the steady rhythm of his work and the safety of his family, checked his watch. He walked to the window and scanned the street. He looked for the flash of pink, the bounce of her dark hair, or the slow, careful gait he knew so well. He saw the usual Sunday crowd, a man in a long coat reading a paper, a woman pushing a pram, a group of teenagers laughing near a parked car. But he did not see Maria Agnes. He waited another 2 minutes, his heart beginning to beat with a heavy, uneven thud against his ribs. He didn't say a word to his wife. He simply grabbed his jacket and headed for the stairs, his footsteps echoing in the stone stairwell like a countdown he couldn't stop. He reached the sidewalk and began to walk, his eyes darting from face to face. He pushed through the crowd, his voice tight as he asked the baker if he had seen a girl in a pink dress. The baker shook his head. He reached the newsstand and asked the vendor. The man looked at the stacks of papers, then back at the father. He hadn't sold a single copy of the Sunday edition to a young girl that afternoon. The father stood on the corner, the noise of the city suddenly sounding distorted and far away, like he was underwater. He looked back toward his apartment, then down the side streets that led toward the Rhone River. The 300 meters that had felt like a backyard only moments ago now felt like a vast, predatory wilderness. He realized that in the heart of a crowded city, his daughter had simply ceased to exist. The police were called, and by sunset, the quiet neighborhood was flooded with blue uniforms and the harsh, sweeping beams of flashlights. They searched every cellar, every attic, and every storage locker in the district. They knocked on every door, showing a small school photograph of a smiling girl with dark eyes. No one had seen her. No one had heard a scream. No one had seen a struggle. It was as if she had been lifted off the pavement by a silent hand. The investigators focused on the man in the long coat seen by several witnesses. But he was a ghost, a silhouette that had vanished into the urban labyrinth of Lyon. The pressure on the family was immense, a crushing weight of what-ifs and if-onlys that made every breath feel like a struggle. The city was no longer a home, it was a collection of hiding places. 2 days later, the search moved toward the banks of the Rhone. The river was high and gray, the water churning with the spring runoff. A volunteer searcher was walking along a lower path, the ground muddy and slick, when he stopped. Hanging from a low, leafless branch of a willow tree was a small piece of fabric. He stepped closer, his boots sinking into the soft silt of the riverbank. It was the pink floral dress. It wasn't torn, and it wasn't dirty. It had been hung neatly over the branch. The sleeves straightened and the collar turned down, as if it were waiting for someone to step back into it. There was no one else there, just the dress, fluttering slightly in the damp wind coming off the water. A clean, silent message left by someone who wanted the world to see what they had taken. The discovery of the dress changed the nature of the fear. It was no longer a search for a missing child. It was a confrontation with a predator who was deliberate, patient, and terrifyingly calm. The fact that the dress was clean and undamaged suggested that Maria Agnes had been taken elsewhere, undressed with a chilling lack of violence, and that her captor had then taken the time to return to the riverbank to leave this ritualistic marker. The police scoured the mud for footprints, but the rising water had smoothed everything over. They found nothing else, no shoes, no coin, and no sign of the girl. The dress was taken into evidence, a small, floral shroud that held the scent of laundry detergent and the cold, lingering damp of the river. The investigation stalled against a wall of silence that would last for the next 50 years. Imagine you are standing on that riverbank. The air is thick with the smell of wet earth and the sharp, metallic tang of the river. The noise of the city is just a dull hum in the distance, replaced by the relentless, heavy sucking sound of the water against the mud. You are looking at a branch that is empty now, but you can still see the shape of the dress in your mind. You feel a sudden, sharp coldness in the pit of your stomach. A realization that the person who stood here was not a monster from a story, but a man who could walk among you unnoticed. You feel the space around you narrowing, the trees closing in, and the river feeling like a dark, open mouth. You want to turn and run back to the lights of the street, but your feet feel heavy, trapped in the silt of a nightmare that has no bottom. As the years passed, the newsstand on the corner was replaced by a modern kiosk, and the baker retired. But the father of Marie Agnès remained. He thought to himself, if I leave this spot, she won't know where to find me when she finally comes home. It was a thought that kept him anchored to that corner for 4 decades. He became a fixture of the neighborhood, a man who stood on the street every Sunday afternoon, his eyes scanning the faces of every young woman who walked past. He wasn't looking for a 12-year-old girl anymore. He was looking for the woman she would have become. He carried the 3 copper coins in his pocket, the metal worn smooth by 40 years of restless handling. He was a man living in a permanent state of 3 minutes past 3, trapped in the gap between the apartment and the newsstand. The case of Marie Agnès Accra became a part of the dark history of Lyon, a story parents told their children to keep them close. The police files grew thick with theories, secret rooms in the old city, a professional stalker who knew the urban layout like the back of his hand, a man who viewed his victims not as people, but as specimens to be collected and displayed. But without a body and without a suspect, the case remained a hollow space in the city's memory. The dress sat in a box in an evidence locker, the pink flowers fading under the fluorescent lights, a tiny, silent witness to a crime that had been executed with a terrifying, surgical precision. The investigation didn't fail because of a lack of effort. It failed because the predator was a man who understood that in a crowd, the best hiding place is right in front of everyone. In 2024, a group of volunteer investigators using high-resolution sonar in the Rhone River made a discovery. Beneath meters of silt and decades of debris, they located a metallic object the size and shape of a child's bicycle from the 1970s. It was found near the spot where the dress had been hung 49 years earlier. The discovery reignited a flicker of hope. But the river is a fickle keeper of secrets. The object was buried deep, and the currents were dangerous. For the family, it was a reminder that while the world moves on, the past is always just beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to emerge. They are still waiting for the day when the river finally gives up the rest of the story, or when the man in the long coat finally steps out of the shadows. The after effect of the disappearance is a quiet, lingering dread that settled over the city of Lyon and never truly left. It is the reason you see parents on that street holding their children's hands just a little tighter when they pass the newsstand. It is the reason the sound of a closing car door or a sudden silence in a crowded square can make a stranger look over their shoulder. The fear doesn't come from the violence of the act, but from the impossible simplicity of it. A girl walked 300 meters and vanished, leaving behind only a clean dress and a lifetime of unanswered questions. It is the realization that the distance between safety and the unknown is not measured in miles, but in the few seconds it takes to look away. That happened in the spring of 1975. 2 years later, in a different part of the world. The air was even thinner, and the isolation was found at the top of the world. In the high, jagged peaks of the Himalayas, 2 men would encounter a silence that was even more absolute than the one on the banks of the Rhone. They were experienced, they were prepared, and they were at the peak of their lives. But they were about to find out that at a certain altitude, the line between being a hunter and being hunted begins to blur into the white mist. Peter pulled the heavy brass zipper of his down parka up to his chin. The sound a sharp, plastic rasp that was immediately swallowed by the predatory roar of the wind. He checked his watch. It was 4 p.m. on the 14th of October, 1977. The sun was already beginning to drop behind the serrated black peaks of the Himachal Pradesh, casting long, jagged shadows across the glacier that looked like reach-inch fingers. At 20,000 feet, the air doesn't just feel thin, it feels sharp, like you are inhaling powdered glass with every breath. He turned his back to the gale. Huddling against the nylon wall of the tent at Base Camp 2, he wasn't thinking about the summit anymore. He was thinking about the fact that for the last 3 days, he hadn't been able to shake the feeling that someone was standing just outside his field of vision, watching him through the white blur of the spindrift. Peter and David were 30-year-old explorers from northern England, men who had spent their entire adult lives moving upward. They were not amateurs looking for a story to tell at a pub. They were methodical, clinical mountaineers who treated a mountain like a mathematical problem to be solved. They had come to this specific, unnamed peak in the Indian Himalayas because it was a blank spot on the map, a challenge of pure navigation and endurance. They were in peak physical condition, their lungs and hearts hardened by years of high-altitude climbing in the Alps and the Andes. They carried the best equipment 1977 had to offer: specialized thermal layers, high-tensile ropes, and a heavy, state-of-the-art radio unit that was their only link to the valley, 4 miles below. They were the kind of men who didn't believe in ghosts, only in oxygen levels and gear ratios. Before they had set out from the last mountain village, a local guide named Tenzin had pulled them aside in the dim, smoky light of a tea house. He didn't talk about the weather or the technical difficulty of the ice chimney they planned to climb. Instead, he spoke about the lights. He told them that on this particular peak, the stars sometimes came down to the ridges, moving with a purpose that didn't match the wind. He warned them that the higher they went, the more they would feel the weight of the watchers. Peter had smiled, thanked the man, and privately dismissed it as high-altitude superstition, the kind of folklore that grows in places where the oxygen is too low for the brain to function properly. But now, standing in the deepening blue shadow of the ridge, the guide's words felt less like a story and more like a set of coordinates. The climb to Base Camp 2 had been grueling but successful. They had established a solid rhythm, moving in the early morning hours when the snow was still frozen and stable. By the 10th day of the expedition, they were exactly where they wanted to be. They had sent a final, clear radio message back to the primary base camp at the foot of the mountain. David's voice had been steady and confident over the static, reporting that they were well provisioned. The weather was holding, and they intended to make their final push for the summit at dawn. It was a standard communication, the kind of routine report that precedes 1,000 successful climbs. But as the sun vanished that evening, the radio went silent, and it stayed silent for the next 7 days. A week later, a rescue party composed of Indian military climbers and local guides reached the plateau where Base Camp 2 was located. They expected to find the aftermath of a disaster, a tent shredded by a storm, the debris of an avalanche, or perhaps the grim remains of a fall. Instead, they found a scene that defied the logic of the mountain. The primary tent was standing perfectly upright, its orange fabric vibrant against the blinding white desert of the glacier. The guidelines were tight and secure, and there was no sign that the mountain had even touched the camp. The heavy snow flaps were weighted down with stones, exactly as Peter and David had been trained to do. From a distance, it looked like the men were simply inside, waiting for the wind to die down so they could start their day. When the lead rescuer unzipped the tent flap, the silence that greeted him was heavier than the cold. He found the interior of the tent in a state of suspended animation. 2 sleeping bags were unrolled and laid out side by side. One of them was partially open, as if someone had just slid out of it. On a small, portable kerosene stove, a pot of water had frozen into a solid block of ice. Next to it was an open tin of meat and 2 tin plates, one with a spoon still resting on its edge. The men's heavy climbing boots were lined up neatly near the entrance. In the world of high-altitude climbing, your boots are your life. You do not leave your tent without them, especially not in a place where the temperature drops to 40 below zero the moment the sun goes down. In 1977, the border between India and China was a place of extreme tension, a high-altitude chessboard where secret military patrols moved through the no-man's land of the peaks. The Indian military search team spent 3 days meticulously documenting the camp. They found no signs of a struggle, no blood, and no foreign footprints in the thin, dry air of the Himalayas. Tracks in the snow can last for days if the wind doesn't scour them away. But around the tent, The snow was a smooth, undisturbed sheet of glass. It was as if Peter and David had simply evaporated from inside their sleeping bags, leaving their clothes, their gear, and their very shoes behind. The soldiers checked the radio unit. It was in perfect working order, with plenty of battery life remaining. One of the rescuers found Peter's expedition journal tucked into the side pocket of his rucksack. The pages were stiff with frost, and the ink had bled into the paper in several places. But the final entry was still legible. It was written in a frantic, jagged hand that contrasted sharply with the neat, technical notes from the previous days. The entry was dated the evening of their final radio check-in. It read, "The fog is too thick. It's coming up from the valley, but it's moving against the wind. David says he hears the humming again. I think someone is following us. Not from below, from above. They are standing on the ridge, just watching. We have to go now." The entry ended there, the pen having slashed across the page as if it had been pulled away mid-sentence. Imagine you are sitting in that tent. The only thing between you and the infinite, freezing void of the Himalayas, is a thin layer of nylon. You can hear the wind, a low, guttural roar that never stops. But then, underneath the noise of the gale, you hear something else. It is a soft, rhythmic thrumming, like a giant heart beating somewhere deep inside the rock of the mountain itself. You look at the wall of the tent and you see a shadow, not a shadow of a bird or a cloud, but a tall, elongated shape that shouldn't be there. You realize that the guide was right, and that the mountain is not just a pile of stone. It is a witness, and in this moment, it has decided that you have seen enough. David sat on the edge of his sleeping bag, his hands shaking as he tried to lace a boot that felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. He thought to himself, I should have listened to the man in the village. Some places aren't meant to be measured. He looked at Peter, who was staring at the tent flap with a look of absolute, hollowed-out terror. The humming was louder now, a vibration that Peter could feel in his teeth and his spine, a sound that seemed to be pulling the very air out of the room. He reached for his journal to write one last warning, but his fingers were too cold to hold the pen. The tent flap didn't blow open. It simply dissolved into the white mist that was now pouring into the small space. The Indian military eventually concluded that the men had suffered from a sudden onset of high-altitude cerebral edema, leading to an episode of collective psychosis that caused them to wander out into the elements. It was a rational, scientific explanation for an irrational event. It ignored the fact that these were seasoned professionals who knew the symptoms of altitude sickness intimately. It ignored the neatly placed boots and the unrolled sleeping bags. The case was officially closed, and the unnamed peak was designated a restricted military zone, effectively banning any further civilian expeditions. For decades, the only things that moved across that glacier were the wind and the occasional secret patrol, both of which remained silent about what they saw. In late 2025, a high-tech drone expedition, funded by a private historical society, was granted a one-week window to fly over the restricted sector. Using high-resolution LiDAR and multispectral cameras, the team scanned the ridges around the site of the former Base Camp 2. On the final day of the mission, the cameras caught something. Nestled deep within a narrow crevasse 300 feet below the ridgeline were fragments of dark blue fabric, a color that perfectly matched the high-end parkas Peter and David had been wearing in 1977. The fabric was frozen deep beneath the permafrost, preserved in a tomb of ice that has not melted in 1,000 years. It was a flicker of hope, a physical link to a story that had been written in the wind. The after effect of the Himalayan disappearance is the realization that the higher we climb, the more we leave behind the laws of the world we understand. It is the feeling you get when you are in a high, empty place, and you feel the sudden urge to look up, certain that something is looking back. The mountain didn't kill Peter and David with a storm or a fall. It simply removed them from the map. They remain there, somewhere under the blue ice. Two men who went looking for a blank spot and ended up becoming one themselves. Their story serves as a warning that there are some heights where the air is too thin for human logic to survive. That happened in the thin air of 77. By the mid-70s in northeast Italy, the air was thicker, filled with the smell of wood smoke and old stone. But the danger was just as invisible. In the province of Udine, a different kind of predator was moving through the fog, a man who didn't use the elements to erase his victims, but used the precision of a scalpel to turn them into specimens. While the Himalayas offered a white, vast silence, the roadsides of Udine were about to be filled with a clinical, surgical horror that would leave the police looking for a monster with the hands of a healer. Antonio slowed the Fiat as he approached the outskirts of Udine. The rhythmic slap of the windshield wipers, the only thing cutting through the heavy, gray silence of the Friuli night. It was late in the autumn of 1975, and the fog had moved in from the Adriatic, thick and cold, turning the familiar vineyards and stone farmhouses into ghost-like silhouettes. He reached out and wiped a circle in the condensation on the glass, his fingers leaving damp streaks that quickly clouded over again. The air inside the car smelled of stale tobacco and the faint, sweet scent of the grappa he'd shared with friends earlier. He looked out at the narrow shoulder of the road, where the tall grass leaned away from the wind. He didn't see the figure standing just beyond the reach of his headlights, but he felt a sudden, inexplicable urge to keep driving, to not stop until he reached the bright, harsh lights of the city center. Udine, in the mid-70s, was a place that felt caught between its ancient, agricultural roots and the cold, industrial future of northern Italy. It was a province of hard-working people, low-slung stone buildings, and a landscape dominated by the jagged, snow-capped peaks of the Carnic Alps. The social atmosphere was conservative, quiet, and deeply private, but beneath this veneer of order, a different kind of life moved through the shadows of the provincial roads. Every night, women from the city and the surrounding villages would line the dark stretches of the highways, looking for work that the factories and farms couldn't provide. They were the freelancers of the night, women who navigated the darkness with a mixture of practiced cynicism and a constant, underlying fear. They knew the risks of their trade, but they believed the dangers were predictable: a violent customer, a robbery, perhaps a run-in with the carabinieri. They were entirely unprepared for the man who was currently moving among them. He was not a brute, and he was not a man driven by a chaotic, unfocused rage. He was a predator of a different caliber, a man who viewed the human body not as a thing of spirit and life, but as a series of anatomical problems to be solved. He was meticulous, patient, and carried with him the tools of a trade that was meant to heal, not to harm. While the rest of Italy was gripped by the political violence of the years of lead, Udine was being haunted by a ghost who didn't care about ideology. He cared about the curve of a rib cage and the precise location of the abdominal wall. He was a man who moved with a clinical silence, a silhouette in a white coat that left behind scenes of such terrifying precision that the police didn't even have a name for the crime they were witnessing. The first body was found in December of 1975, dumped on a quiet embankment near the town of Pratamano. The victim was a woman in her late 20s, her coat neatly buttoned, her shoes still on her feet. When the local carabinieri arrived, they expected the messy, jagged aftermath of a typical roadside assault. Instead, they found something that made the lead investigator, a man used to the harsh realities of rural crime, turn away and cover his mouth. The woman had been killed quickly, but what happened afterward was the true horror. Her abdomen had been opened with a single, continuous, shaped incision that began at the sternum and curved gracefully down toward the hip. It was a cut made with such expert pressure and such a steady hand that there were no jagged edges, no hesitation marks, and almost no blood on her clothing. It was a surgical procedure performed in the mud. The pressure began to build within the Udine Police Department like steam in a sealed pipe. They kept the details of the incision from the public, fearing a mass panic. But within the walls of the station, the air was thick with a new kind of tension. They consulted with local coroners and medical examiners, Men who spent their lives over autopsy tables. Every one of them said the same thing: this was not the work of a madman with a kitchen knife. This was the work of someone who knew exactly where the organs sat. Someone who understood how to move a blade through skin and muscle with the efficiency of a practitioner. The police began to monitor the local hospitals and medical schools, looking for a doctor or a student who showed signs of instability. They were looking for a monster, but all they found were men in white coats who looked perfectly normal. Men who spoke with calm, educated voices and went home to their families every night. By the spring of 1976, 2 more bodies had been found, each left with the same shaped signature. The Monster of Udine was no longer a theory, he was a recurring nightmare. The victims were always found in places that suggested the killer was intimately familiar with the geography of the province's hidden turnoffs, irrigation ditches, and the edges of cornfields that were invisible to anyone who didn't live there. The realization settled over the city that the killer was one of their own, a neighbor who understood the rhythm of the local roads. The fear became a physical presence in the streets. Women who worked the night shifts began to carry small knives or whistles, and the sound of a car slowing down on a dark road became enough to make a heart stop. The killer wasn't just taking lives, he was dissecting the very sense of security that held the community together. Imagine you are sitting in the passenger seat of a car, the interior smelling of expensive leather and a faint pound, sharp scent of antiseptic that reminds you of a dentist's office. The man driving is well dressed, his hands on the wheel steady and clean, his fingernails trimmed to perfection. He speaks in a soft, reassuring tone, and for a moment, you feel a sense of relief. This is not a man to be feared. But then, he turns off the main highway onto a dirt track that leads deep into the fog-shrouded vineyards. You ask him where he is going, and he doesn't answer. He simply reaches into his pocket and pulls out a small, silver object that catches the dim light of the dashboard. It is a scalpel. Its blade so thin, it is almost invisible. You realize in that moment that you are not a person to him. You are a specimen, and the room you are in is not a car, but a theater where the play is about to begin. Maria sat in the back of a small cafe in the center of Udine, her hands wrapped around a cup of espresso that had long since gone cold. It was 2 a.m, and the rain was drumming against the cobblestones outside. She thought to herself, if I just stay here until the sun comes up, I'll be fine. The light will make the shadows go away. She looked at the other women in the cafe, seeing the same hollowed-out look in their eyes. They were all waiting for the morning, all trapped in a world where a man with a steady hand was moving through the mist. She felt the vibration of a car passing outside, and she instinctively pulled her coat tighter around her throat, the wool feeling scratchy and thin against her skin. She didn't know that the man she feared wasn't looking for a struggle. He was looking for a moment of absolute, clinical stillness. The golden point of the investigation came in late 1976, when a prominent psychiatrist provided a pinpoint accurate psychological profile of the killer. He described a man who likely had a high-functioning medical background, someone who felt a profound need for control and who viewed the act of surgery as a form of divine power. He warned the police that the killer wouldn't stop until he was physically prevented from continuing, and that his obsession with the shaped incision was a ritualistic attempt to mark his territory. The police, however, were under immense pressure from the local government to avoid a scandal involving the medical community. The profile was filed away, and the investigation continued to focus on vagrants and low-level criminals, men who didn't have the hands or the heart for the work the monster was doing. The consequences of this failure were devastating. The monster continued his spree for over a decade, with a total of 13 victims, eventually linked to his specific surgical methodology. Each scene was a replica of the first, a body left in a precise location, the clothing disturbed only enough to allow for the incision, and a total lack of forensic evidence. The killer was a master of the clean crime scene, leaving no DNA, no fingerprints, and no witnesses, a main suspect. A local doctor with a history of erratic behavior was eventually arrested years later. but he was acquitted due to a total lack of physical evidence. The legal system, built on the need for concrete proof, was helpless against a man who treated every murder like a sterile operation in a private clinic. The after effect of the Monster of Udine is a cold, lingering shadow that still hangs over the Friuli-Venezia Giulia region. It is the reason that even now, decades later, the back roads of Udine feel a little more dangerous than they should. The case remains officially unsolved, a ghost in the archives of the Italian police. In 2025, a new task force began using advanced genealogy databases to cross-reference DNA samples recovered from the later victims with the descendants of medical professionals who lived in the area in the 70s. There is a hope that the code of the monster is finally being cracked, not by a detective in a foggy field, but by a technician in a brightly lit lab. But for the families of the 13 women, the answer will come too late to change the silence that followed the snap of a surgical glove. The story of Udine is a reminder that the most terrifying predators are often the ones who have been trained to help us. The fear doesn't come from the darkness, but from the realization that the hands we trust can also be the hands that betray us. It is the sound of a scalpel gliding over skin, a sound so quiet it can only be heard in the absolute silence of a life coming to an end. It is the clinical smell of antiseptic in a place where only the smell of damp earth should be. It is the knowledge that somewhere out there, a man lived a full life with a secret carved into the bodies of 13 women. A secret shaped like a graceful, terrifying letter S. The ocean eventually gives back what it takes. But some things are taken in the middle of a crowded dance floor and never return. From the clinical, fog-shrouded fields of Italy, we move to the vibrant Salzstung coast of Rio de Janeiro, where the roar of the Atlantic provides a different kind of mask for a crime. In the high society penthouses of Brazil, the danger didn't come from a medical scalpel, but from the crushing weight of a billionaire's influence and the violent waves that beat against the jagged rocks of the Niemeyer coast. Claudia stood in the master suite of the penthouse, her reflection framed by an ornate gold leaf mirror that seemed to vibrate with the heavy, rhythmic thrum of the music coming from the living room. She raised a hand to her ear, carefully adjusting a small gold hoop, her fingers steady despite the heat of the Rio evening. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the lights of Leblon twinkled like a carpet of fallen stars, and beyond them, the Atlantic Ocean was a vast, black void that swallowed the horizon. It was the night of July 26th, 1977, and the air inside the apartment was thick with the scent of expensive perfume, imported scotch, and the sharp, chemical tang of the cocaine that sat in crystal bowls on the mahogany sideboards. She took a deep breath, checked her lipstick one last time, and turned to rejoin the party, unaware that the reflection in the mirror was the last version of herself the world would ever see alive. Rio de Janeiro in the late 1970s was a city of extreme contrasts, a place where the jagged green mountains seemed to be trying to push the glittering high-rises into the sea. It was the height of the military dictatorship, a time of censorship and shadow, but for the young and the wealthy. The city felt like a playground without boundaries. The elite lived in a bubble of luxury, moving between private clubs and fortified penthouses, shielded from the social unrest by mountains of cash and political influence. Claudia Lessing Rodriguez was 21 years old, a girl whose beauty was a ticket into these exclusive circles. Her sister, Marcia, was a well-known singer, and Claudia often found herself invited to the kind of gatherings where the guest list was more important than the conversation. She was vibrant, ambitious, and possessed a quiet confidence that made people notice her the moment she walked into a room. The party that night was being held at the home of Michel Frank, a Swiss-born billionaire and a notorious figure in Rio's Playboy scene. Frank was a man who lived with a reckless intensity, a billionaire who used his wealth like a blunt instrument. He was known for his love of fast cars, beautiful women, and the kind of drug-fueled marathons that lasted until the sun was high over the Christ the Redeemer statue. His apartment was a temple to excess, filled with modern art and soft leather furniture that seemed designed to absorb the secrets of those who sat on it. Along with his close friend, George Kourous, Frank presided over the evening with a cold, predatory charm to the young women invited to these parties. Men like Frank and Kourous were seen as gatekeepers to a life of glamour, but they were also men who believed that their money made them exempt from the laws of basic human decency. As the clock ticked past midnight, the atmosphere in the penthouse began to shift. The easy laughter and the clinking of glasses were replaced by a jagged, frantic energy. The music grew louder, the bass notes acting like a physical pressure against the chest, and the air grew stagnant as the air conditioning struggled against the heat of 30 people packed into the living room. Claudia began to feel the first stirrings of unease. She noticed that the doors to the main hallway were now closed, and several of the men were watching her with a focused, predatory intensity that made the hair on her arms stand up. She looked for a familiar face, a friend who might want to leave, but the room was filled with strangers whose eyes were glassy and distant. She decided it was time to go home, but when she moved toward the exit, she found her path blocked by a man who didn't move when she asked him to step aside. The first deviation from the night's festive script was subtle. Michel Frank approached Claudia, his voice a low, gravelly whisper that was barely audible over the music. He invited her into one of the back bedrooms, claiming he had something he wanted to show her. When she declined, his polite veneer didn't just crack, it vanished. His face went tight, and he gripped her upper arm with a strength that left an immediate, dull ache in the bone. He didn't yell, and he didn't make a scene. He simply leaned in close, expensive gin, and told her that in this house, nobody said no to him. The pressure in the room seemed to double. The walls of the luxury apartment suddenly felt like they were moving inward, trapping her in a space that was no longer a party, but a cage. She looked at the heavy wooden door of the bedroom and realized that the locks were not there to keep the world out, but to keep her in. Imagine you are standing on a balcony 20 stories above the ground. The wind is whipping your hair across your face, and the salt spray from the ocean below is a cold mist on your skin. Behind you, the party is a distorted blur of sound and light. But in front of you, there is only the drop. You can hear the rhythmic, thunderous roar of the Atlantic hitting the rocks at the base of the cliff, a sound that vibrates in your very teeth. You realize that your life is now measured in the few feet of concrete between you and the edge. The person standing next to you isn't a friend, and they aren't listening to your pleas. They are looking at you as if you are nothing more than a problem to be solved, a piece of evidence that needs to be discarded. The silence of the night is suddenly louder than any music, a heavy, suffocating weight that tells you no one is coming to help. In that moment of absolute terror, as the grip on her arm tightened and the reality of her situation became undeniable, Claudia had one sharp, clear thought: I should have never let them take my shoes. It was a small, practical realization that hit her with the force of a physical blow. Without her heels, she felt smaller, more vulnerable, her feet cold against the expensive marble floor. It was the thought of a person trying to find a footing in a world that had suddenly become frictionless. She looked down at her bare toes and felt a profound sense of loss, as if those shoes represented the last of her agency, the last part of her that could choose to walk away. She tried to pull back, to find some leverage against the man holding her, but the marble was slick, and her strength was no match for the adrenaline-fueled rage of the men surrounding her. The violence that followed was not a single explosive event, but a slow, systematic breaking of a human being. Witnesses later spoke of hearing muffled cries and the sound of furniture being overturned, sounds that were quickly drowned out by someone turning the volume of the stereo to its limit. The pressure in the penthouse became absolute, a vacuum where the normal rules of society were suspended. Michel Frank and George Kourous, driven by a mixture of narcotics and a deep-seated hatred for anyone who challenged their authority, subjected Claudia to a brutal assault that lasted for hours. They viewed her resistance not as a right, but as an insult, By the time the sun began to peek over the horizon on the morning of July 27th, Claudia Lesson Rodriguez was no longer a guest. She was a liability. The point of no return came in the gray, pre-dawn light. The decision was made to move her, to use the geography of Rio to bury the crime. They wrapped her body in a heavy plastic sheet, the sound of the crinkling material loud in the sudden silence of the apartment. They took her down the service elevator, moving through the basement garage where the luxury cars sat like sleeping predators. They drove out along the Avenida Niemeyer, a winding coastal road that hugs the base of the cliffs, where the mountains drop straight into the sea. The road was empty. The only sound the hum of the tires on the asphalt and the distant, eternal roar of the waves. At a particularly jagged stretch of the coast, they stopped the car. They carried the bundle to the edge and watched as it vanished into the white foam and the black rocks below. They didn't stay to watch the tide. They simply turned the car around and drove back to the city to begin the process of erasing her name. A few hours later, a local fisherman named Zay was navigating his small wooden boat near the base of the Niemeyer cliffs. The morning fog was lifting, and the sea was unusually choppy. He saw something wedged between two large, black rocks, a flash of pale color against the dark stone. He thought at first it was a piece of driftwood or a discarded sack of flour, but as the swell pushed his boat closer, he saw a human hand. The fingers curled as if trying to grip the rock. He crossed himself, the cold salt air suddenly feeling like ice in his lungs. He didn't touch the body. He simply turned his boat back toward the shore, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He knew the stories of the people who vanished in Rio, but this was different. This was a message left by the sea, a physical proof that the shadows of the city were real. The discovery of the body sent a shockwave through Rio society. When the police identified the victim as the sister of Marcia Rodriguez, the case became a national obsession. The autopsy revealed the full extent of the brutality. Claudia had suffered blunt force trauma, internal injuries, and signs of a prolonged struggle. The evidence led directly back to the penthouse in Lyon. Investigators found traces of blood on the marble floor and fibers from the plastic sheet in the trunk of Michel Frank's car. For a brief moment, it looked as if the shield of wealth might actually break. The press labeled it the Niemeyer Horror, and the public demanded that the billionaire and his friend face justice. But the pressure of the law was nothing compared to the pressure of influence. Michel Frank didn't wait for a trial. Using his Swiss passport and a network of high-level connections, he fled the country within days of being named a suspect. He landed in Switzerland, a country that, at the time, had no extradition treaty with Brazil for crimes of this nature. From the safety of his family's estate, he watched as the legal system in Rio began to grind to a halt. Evidence went missing from the police lockers. Witnesses suddenly suffered from memory loss, and the lead detective was reassigned to a remote post in the interior of the country. George Kourous was eventually arrested and put on trial, but the proceedings were a masterpiece of legal theater. Despite the overwhelming forensic evidence, he was acquitted of the murder, with the judge citing a lack of certainty regarding the exact moment of Claudia's death. The consequences of the Claudia Lesson Rodriguez case were a bitter pill for the people of Brazil. It became a symbol of the impunity of the elite, a stark reminder that in 1977, the life of a young woman was worth less than the reputation of a billionaire. Marcia Rodriguez spent the rest of her life fighting for her sister, using every media appearance and every concert to keep Claudia's name in the public eye. She became a thorn in the side of the military government, a woman who refused to let the ocean swallow the truth. But despite her efforts, Michel Frank never returned to Brazil. He lived a full, luxurious life in Europe, eventually dying of natural causes decades later, never having spent a single day in a jail cell for what happened on that July night. The after effect of the story is a lingering, salty bitterness that still hangs over the Niemeyer coast. Even now, nearly 50 years later, people walking along the cliffs will look down at the jagged rocks and think of the girl in the pink dress who was discarded like trash. In 2024, a major streaming service released a documentary series about the case, using modern investigative techniques to re-examine the original evidence. The series went viral across South America, sparking a new conversation about the protection of women and the corruption of the legal system. It proved that while you can bury a body and by a judge, you cannot kill a memory. The roar of the Atlantic still sounds like a cry for help to those who know the history of that road, a reminder that the sea never truly forgets what it has been asked to hide. Sometimes what breaks a person is not the danger itself. It is the moment just before it, when everything still looks completely normal. It is the contrast between the warmth of a crowded room and the sudden, freezing realization that you are alone. In the vibrant nightclubs of Ghana, where the music was loud and the new year was being welcomed with open arms, a young woman would experience that same sharp transition. She would walk away from the lights and the laughter, leaving behind only her shoes, and step into a silence that was just as absolute and just as permanent as the one found on the rocks of Rio. Comfort sat on the small wooden stool in the cramped dressing room of the Tiptoe nightclub, her fingers moving in a steady, rhythmic circle. She held a piece of soft, lint-free cloth that was stained gray with polishing compound. In her other hand was a silver dancing shoe. It was 1976, the final day of December, and the air in Accra was a physical weight hot, stagnant, and smelling of salt from the Gulf of Guinea and the faint, sweet scent of roasting plantains from a street vendor outside. She pressed the cloth into the leather, watching the dull surface transform into a mirror that caught the amber glow of the single light bulb hanging from the ceiling. Outside the door, she could hear the band warming up, the discordant blare of a trumpet and the deep, hollow thump of a bass guitar vibrating through the plywood walls. The Tiptoe was not just a nightclub, it was the beating heart of the Ghanaian highlife scene. In the mid-70s, Accra was a city that lived for the night. The streets were filled with the sound of horns and the rhythmic chatter of people who believed that the future was something you could reach out and touch. The club itself was a sprawling, open-air pavilion surrounded by a high concrete wall topped with jagged glass. Inside, the floor was made of polished mahogany that had been worn smooth by the feet of thousands of dancers. It was a place of smoke, sweat, and a specific kind of electric joy that only exists on the edge of a new year. On this night, every table was packed. The air was a thick haze of cigarette smoke and expensive perfume, a cloud that seemed to pulse in time with the music. Comfort Owusu was 21 years old, and in the world of Ghanaian dance, she was a supernova. She didn't just move to the music, she seemed to dictate its rhythm. When she took the floor, the rest of the room tended to fade into a blur of static. She was a young woman who knew her value, a daughter of a hardworking family who saw her talent as a way to lift everyone around her. She was ambitious, but grounded. A girl who spent her mornings practicing her steps until her feet bled and her evenings being the center of the universe. As she finished polishing the second shoe, she stood up and stepped into them, the buckles snapping shut with a crisp, final click. She looked at her reflection in the cracked mirror and thought to himself, "Tonight, the floor belongs to me, and the world is finally going to see it." She walked out of the dressing room and into the main hall, the transition from the quiet of the back room to the roar of the crowd feeling like a physical blow. The band, a group of seasoned veterans who had played for presidents and kings, launched into a fast, driving high-life rhythm. The sound was a pressure that acted on the body, the blast of the brass section making the skin on Comfort's arms prickle, and the heavy vibration of the drums thumping against her ribs like a second heartbeat. She moved to the center of the floor, the silver of her shoes flashing under the colored lights. For the next hour, she was a blur of motion. She danced with an intensity that seemed to defy the humidity, her movements sharp, precise, and effortlessly fluid. The crowd was mesmerized. Among them were the regulars, the tourists, and the big men, the wealthy elite of Accra, who sat at the front tables, their gold watches glinting in the dark. These were men who moved in circles of power that most people only heard about in whispers. They watched Comfort with a focused, silent intensity that was different from the loud cheers of the rest of the room. As the set neared its end, the band slowed the tempo, the saxophone wailing a long, soulful note that seemed to hang in the air like smoke. Comfort took a final bow, her skin glowing with sweat, her chest heaving as she inhaled the hot, oxygen-starved air of the club. She leaned over to the bandleader, whispered that she was going to the restroom to freshen up, and walked toward the back exit. The first deviation from the night's festive rhythm was so small, it was almost invisible. Comfort's friends, who were sitting at a table near the stage, watched her walk away. They expected her to be back in 5 minutes, just in time for the countdown to midnight. But 5 minutes turned into 10, and then 15. The band began to play a slow, upbeat number to lead into the new year. But the spot on the stage where Comfort usually stood remained empty. One of her friends, a girl named Abena, felt a sudden, sharp chill that had nothing to do with the night air. She stood up and walked toward the restrooms, pushing through the crowd of people who were laughing and clinking glasses, oblivious to the fact that the star of the show had not returned. Abena reached the restroom area, a small, dimly lit hallway near the rear of the building. The door to the ladies' room was hanging open. Inside, the space was empty. The small window, high on the wall, was still latched, and the air smelled of cheap soap and damp concrete. Abena walked back out into the hallway, her heart beginning to beat with a heavy, uneven thud. She looked toward the back exit, a heavy iron door that led to a small alleyway where the delivery trucks parked. The door was slightly ajar, a sliver of the dark outside world cutting through the amber light of the club. She walked toward it, her footsteps sounding hollow on the wooden floorboards, and that was when she saw them. Lying in the middle of the floor, just a few feet from the bandstand, were the silver dancing shoes. They were sitting side by side, perfectly aligned, as if Comfort had simply stepped out of them and vanished into the ceiling. They were still shiny, the polish she had applied only an hour ago reflecting the flickering lights of the club. There were no scuff marks, no signs of a struggle, and no footprints leading away from them. To anyone who knew Comfort, this was the most terrifying detail of all. She loved those shoes. They were her tools, her pride, and she would never have left them on a dirty floor. The sight of them sitting there, empty and silent, felt like a scream that no one could hear. The pressure inside the tiptoe changed instantly. The countdown to midnight began 10, 9, 8, but for the small group of people standing around the silver shoes, the new year didn't feel like a beginning. It felt like an ending. The roar of the crowd as the clock struck 12 was a deafening, distorted noise that seemed to press in on Abena from all sides. She looked at the shoes, then at the open back door, and realized that while thousands of people were celebrating, her friend had been taken. The noise of the horns and the cheering felt like a physical weight, a blast of sound that made her inner ears ache and her balance falter. She reached out to grab the edge of a table, her fingers trembling against the wood. The search began immediately, but it was hampered by the chaos of the New Year's celebrations. The police were called, but they struggled to get their vehicles through the crowded streets of Accra. By the time they arrived at the club, the scene had been trampled by hundreds of departing guests. The investigators interviewed the staff, the musicians, and the patrons, but the stories were all the same. No one had seen Comfort leave. No one had heard a cry for help. The nightclub was a fortress of sound and light, and yet, a woman had been removed from its center without anyone noticing. The only clue was a report from a young boy who had been selling matches outside the back exit. He claimed he had seen a large, black car with tinted windows idling in the alleyway, and that it had sped away just as the music reached its peak. In 1976, a large black car in Accra was a symbol of the elite, the powerful men who operated above the law. The investigation quickly hit a wall of silence. The owner of the Tiptoe, a man who had built his reputation on providing a safe, vibrant space for the community, was devastated. He cooperated fully with the police, but he could feel the pressure from the big men who frequented his club. They didn't want a scandal, and they didn't want the police poking around their private lives. Within a month, the lead detective on the case was reassigned to a remote northern province, and the file on Comfort Owusu began to gather dust. The club owner, haunted by the sight of the empty shoes and the silence of the authorities, closed the doors of the Tiptoe a year later. He said the music didn't sound right anymore. The disappearance of the missing dancer became a ghost story that haunted the streets of Accra for decades. It was a tale of what happens when the lights are too bright and the music is too loud, the way a person can be erased in plain sight. Rumors persisted that Comfort had been taken by a powerful figure who wanted her for his private collection, or that she had seen something she wasn't supposed to see in the VIP section of the club. But without evidence, these stories were just smoke. The silver shoes were kept by her mother, sitting on a shelf in a small house in the suburbs. A constant, shimmering reminder of a night that never ended. They were a physical link to a daughter who had walked into a restroom and out of history. 50 years later, the story has found a new life. In 2026, a documentary titled The Last Dance at Tiptoe was released in Ghana, sparking a nationwide conversation about the cold cases of the 70s. The filmmakers used modern digital enhancement on old photographs and interviewed elderly witnesses who were finally ready to speak. They received a series of anonymous tips about a private estate on the coast where a famous dancer had lived in total seclusion for years. But the leads were cold. The people involved long dead. The documentary served as a final way. Urgent call for anyone with information to come forward before the last echoes of that night faded away forever. It was an attempt to give a name and a voice back to the girl who had been silenced by the roar of the crowd. The after effect of Comfort Owusu's disappearance is the realization that a crowd is not a shield. Sometimes, it is a mask. It is the chilling thought that you can be surrounded by friends, family, and admirers, and still be completely alone in the moment it matters most. The fear doesn't come from the alleyway or the dark street, but from the dance floor itself, the place where you feel most alive. The silver shoes remain a symbol of that transition. A pair of objects that lost their meaning the moment the person inside them vanished. They are a reminder that the world can close in around you even when the music is playing, and that sometimes the most terrifying thing a person can leave behind is a perfect, silent pair. That happened in the vibrant, smoky clubs of Ghana, where the air was thick with the promise of a new year. But on the other side of the world, in a city where the sky stayed gray for months, a different kind of silence had already been waiting. In Santiago, the noise of the rush hour provided a different kind of cover for a disappearance that was just as quiet and just as absolute. There, the object left behind wasn't a pair of shoes, but a neatly folded blazer sitting on a park bench. A piece of clothing that held a secret in its pocket and a silence that would last for a lifetime. Marta slid the heavy iron key into her desk drawer, the metal scraping against the wood with a sharp, familiar sound that signaled the end of another day. It was 5 o'clock on a Tuesday afternoon in November, 1977. Outside the law office, Santiago was a churning sea of gray exhaust and the rhythmic, metallic clatter of the metro. She closed the drawer, smoothed the lapels of her navy blue blazer, and stepped out into the hallway. Marta Reyes was 23 years old, a woman whose life was built on a foundation of spreadsheets and strict schedules. She was a legal secretary, the kind of employee who was valued precisely because she was predictable. She didn't stay late. She didn't take long lunches, and she never missed her train. She moved through the city like a shadow, efficient and invisible, her formal suit a uniform of respectability in a city that felt increasingly lawless. The walk from the office to the station usually took 8 minutes. In 1977, the air in Chile was thick with a different kind of tension. Unmarked vans cruised the boulevards, and the eyes of the secret police were everywhere. Marta, however, had no political ties. She was a girl who followed the rules of the state as carefully as she followed the rules of her office. She believed that if she stayed on the main path, the shadows wouldn't notice her. But she never made it to the platform. Her family waited at the kitchen table, the dinner cooling as the minutes turned into hours. The next morning, a groundskeeper at a small park 3 blocks from her office found her blazer. It was draped over the back of a wooden bench, the sleeves hanging straight, as if it had been placed there by a tailor. The fabric was clean, and there were no signs of a struggle in the dirt nearby. It was as if she had simply stepped out of her clothes. Inside the blazer's right pocket, the police found 2 things: a single, heavy iron key and a blank piece of white paper. The key didn't fit her office or her home. The paper held no ink, no indentation, nothing. It was a message that said absolutely nothing, which in 1977 Santiago was the loudest sound in the world. The pressure of the silence began to act on her family, a weight that made the walls of their apartment feel like they were closing in. Imagine you are standing under that lone street lamp. The noise of the rush hour is a dull, distant roar, like a storm that has already passed. You are looking at a navy blue garment that belongs to someone you love. You reach out and touch the wool, and it is still slightly warm from the sun, but the person who wore it is gone. You feel a sudden, sharp vibration in your chest, a sense that the very air around you is being pulled away, leaving you in a vacuum of unanswered questions. As she turned the corner toward the park, Marta had one brief, crystalline thought. I wonder if they noticed I missed a comma on page 3. It was a small, clerical worry, a tether to the mundane world she was about to leave behind forever. It was the thought of a person who expected to be back at her desk the following morning. She didn't look over her shoulder. She didn't see the van idling at the curb. She only saw the fading light reflecting off the park's iron gates. The lead investigator, a man who had seen too many people vanish into the machinery of the state, looked at the blank paper and felt a cold, hollow ache in his spine. He knew that in a city governed by records, a blank page was a death sentence. There were no arrest records for Marta Reyes, no secret police files, and no witnesses. She had been erased by a predator who used the chaos of the time as a cloak, a shadow that moved through the crowd without disturbing a single person. The after effect of the disappearance was a lingering, gray dread that settled over the legal district. It was the realization that you could be a perfect citizen, a person who lived by the clock, and still be taken in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon. The blazer sat in an evidence box for years, the navy wool slowly gathering dust, the iron key becoming a rusted relic of a life interrupted. Marta Reyes became a ghost in the capital, a reminder that some silences are louder than any scream. Anka stood at the center of the cramped dormitory room, the linoleum floor cold and sticky beneath her feet. She reached down and unbuckled the leather strap of her heavy, brown suitcase, the metal tang of the buckle biting into her thumb. It was a humid afternoon in July, 1977, and the air in Bucharest felt thick with the smell of wet asphalt and cheap tobacco. She lifted the lid of the suitcase, revealing a stack of neatly folded blouses and a thick pile of textbooks, their edges softened by months of intense study. She was 18 years old, and she had just moved to the capital from a small village in the Romanian countryside. For Anka, this room wasn't just a place to sleep, it was the gateway to her future. She checked her watch, adjusted her hair in the small, silvered mirror on the wall, and stepped out into the hallway, the sound of her own footsteps echoing against the concrete walls like a promise. In 1977, Bucharest was a city that felt as though it were being slowly compressed by the weight of the Ceausescu regime. The architecture was a forest of gray, brutalist concrete, and the streets were filled with the constant, low-frequency hum of the city's aging tram system. For a young woman like Anka Broscu, the city was both a dream and a cage. She was a brilliant student, a girl whose parents had saved every spare leu to send her to the city to sit for her university entrance exams. She was quiet, focused, and possessed a level of discipline that made her stand out even in a society that demanded total conformity. She lived her life by a strict schedule: study, eat, walk to the library, return to the dormitory. She believed that if she kept her head down and followed the rules, the gray world of the capital would eventually open up and give her a life of meaning. The first deviation from this predictable life happened on the afternoon of July 6th. Anka had finished her morning study session and was heading to a nearby newsstand to pick up a copy of a student journal. She never arrived. In a city where the Securitate, the state's omnipresent secret police, kept a record of almost every movement, a person vanishing in broad daylight was supposed to be impossible. But as the sun set over the jagged skyline of Bucharest, Anka Broscu had simply ceased to be. The silence that followed her disappearance was not immediate. It began as a whisper in the dormitory hallway, a slow realization among her friends that her bed was still made and her books were untouched. By the following morning, the whisper had turned into a frantic search by her parents, who had traveled from their village with a fear that made every breath feel like a struggle. 2 days later, the silence was shattered. A commuter on a public bus near the Gare du Nord station noticed an unclaimed suitcase sitting under a rear seat. It was an old, battered thing, tied shut with a piece of rough hemp rope. When the bus driver opened it at the end of the line, expecting to find forgotten clothes or tools, he found instead a visceral horror that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Inside the suitcase, wrapped carefully in layers of old newspapers, were human remains. The police were called, and within hours, the discovery had sparked a wave of panic that threatened to destabilize the image of the perfect socialist state. The regime had no room for serial killers or violent crime. Such things were officially considered capitalist diseases. The pressure to find a killer was immediate, political, and absolute. The state didn't need a guilty man. They needed a man they could make guilty. Their eyes fell upon Gheorghe Samoilescu, a 31-year-old taxi driver with a wife and 2 young children. Gheorghe was a man whose life was defined by the long, exhausting hours he spent navigating the gray streets of Bucharest in his Dacia. He was a normal man, a man who worked hard to provide a modest life for his family. He had no criminal record, no history of violence, and no connection to Anka Broscu. But he had a misfortune that in 1977 was worse than any crime. He was the last person the police could place in the general vicinity of where they believed Anka had been taken. To the Securitate, he was a blank page onto which they could write a confession. Gheorghe was arrested in the middle of the night, pulled from his bed while his wife and children watched in frozen terror. He was taken to a basement cell in the Kalia Rahove prison, a place where the walls were so thick that the sound of the city above was replaced by a heavy, suffocating silence. For the next several weeks, Gheorghe's reality was reduced to a few square feet of damp concrete and the cold, unblinking eyes of his interrogators. They didn't ask him questions. They told him what he had done. They described the suitcase, the rope, and the newspaper in such detail that Gheorghe began to feel as though he were remembering a nightmare he had never actually had. The pressure was not just psychological, it was a physical force that acted on his body day and night. The interrogation sessions were a masterclass in calculated brutality. The room was always cold, the only light coming from a single, high-intensity bulb that burned through Gheorghe's eyelids even when he tried to sleep. The investigators used a rhythmic, low-frequency humming sound piped into the cell, a sound that made his teeth ache and his balance falter. But the real pressure came from the silence. They would sit him in a chair for hours, saying nothing, the only sound the slow, deliberate ticking of a clock on the wall. They wanted him to understand that his life was no longer his own, that he was merely a piece of evidence to be shaped. When he refused to sign the confession, they moved from the silence to the leather lash, a sound that cracked through the basement like a dry gunshot. Imagine you are kneeling on that cold, wet floor. Your hands are tied behind your back, and the only thing you can see is the gray, pitted surface of the concrete just inches from your face. You can hear the heavy, rhythmic breathing of the man standing behind you, a sound that feels like it's being inhaled directly from your own lungs. You want to tell the truth, but the truth is a language they no longer speak. You realize that the only way to make the pain stop, the only way to ever see the sun again, is to become the monster they want you to be. The space around you is narrowing. The air feels like it's being sucked out of the room, and you have to make a choice with no way back. You are no longer a father or a husband. You are a target. In that moment of absolute, crushing despair, as the leather hit his back for the 100th time, Gerge had one sharp, agonizing thought. I hope my wife remembered to pay the electric bill. It was a small, mundane worry that flared up in his mind like a dying ember. A desperate attempt to anchor himself to a life that was being systematically erased. He could see the kitchen table in his mind, the way the light hit the handle of the tea kettle, and the sound of his children's laughter. But then the lash hit again, and the kitchen table dissolved into the blackness of the cell. He realized that the person who lived in that apartment was already dead. The man on the floor was someone else, a shadow being forced to admit to a crime that defied human comprehension. Gheorghe signed the confession. He admitted to everything: the kidnapping, the murder, the dismemberment, and the suitcase. He gave them the details they had fed him, speaking the words like a script he had memorized in the dark. The state held a show trial, a masterpiece of judicial theater designed to prove the efficiency of the Romanian police. Gheorghe sat in the dock, his eyes hollow, his body a map of bruises that the cameras were careful to avoid. He was sentenced to 25 years in a labor camp, a death sentence in all but name. His wife, unable to bear the shame and the constant harassment from the Securitate, committed suicide months later. His children were taken by the state. The life of Gheorghe Samoilescu had been completely dismantled to satisfy the quota of a regime that could not admit failure. But the story of Anca Broscu had a final, terrifying twist. 3 years into Gheorghe's sentence, in 1980, another suitcase was found on a bus in Bucharest. Then another. The Anca case was happening again. The police, working with a desperation that bordered on panic, eventually caught a man named Romka Kosmici mid-crime. Kosmici was a true predator, a necrophile who had been stalking the streets of the capital for years. When they searched his apartment, they found evidence that he was the one who had murdered Anca Broscu in 1977. He had been active the entire time Gheorghe was being tortured in a cell. The real killer had been moving through the gray fog of the city, watching as an innocent man took the fall for his crimes, emboldened by the state's failure. The consequences were a national scandal that the regime tried, and failed, to bury. Gheorghe Samoilescu was released from prison. But the man who stepped out into the light of 1981 was not the man who had been taken from his bed 4 years earlier. He was a ghost, a broken shell of a person who had lost his wife, his children, and his very soul. The state offered him no apology and no compensation. He spent the rest of his life in a small, damp room, staring at the walls, the sound of the leather lash still echoing in his inner ears every time the wind caught the door. His case became a mandatory study in Romanian law schools after the fall of the regime, a grim warning against the use of forced confessions and the horror of a justice system that values efficiency over truth. The after effect of the Anca mystery is a lingering, cold dread that still settles over the city of Bucharest when the fog rolls in. It is the realization that the most dangerous thing in a city is not always the predator in the shadows, but the system that is supposed to protect you. The suitcase on the bus remains a symbol of that failure, an object that held not just the remains of a young girl, but the remains of an entire society's belief in justice. Anca Broscu and Gheorghe Samoilescu were both victims of a city that didn't have room for the truth. Two lives that were erased by the same gray, industrial silence that continues to haunt the archives of the Romanian police. People say the outside world is where the danger is. But most of the time, the threat does not come from strangers. It comes from someone who knows your name. It comes from a neighbor who smiles at you in the hallway, a man who shops at the same grocery store and goes to the same church, From the grey, oppressive streets of Bucharest, we moved to the Baltic coast of Poland, where a man with a gentle face and a dedicated family life was hiding a weapon wrapped in cloth, a tool of construction that he had turned into a signature of death. Pavel Tuchlin stood at the heavy iron sink in the locker room of the Gdańsk shipyard, the smell of industrial degreaser and cold water filling the cramped space. He wiped a streak of black grease from his palm with a rough, gray rag, moving with a methodical, slow precision. It was late 1977, a Tuesday evening, and the Baltic fog was already pressing against the frosted windows of the factory. He checked his watch exactly 4:15 in the afternoon. He hung the rag on its hook, smoothed his dark hair, and walked out into the cooling air, a man who looked exactly like 1,000 other men leaving the docks. The city of Gdańsk in the late 70s was a landscape of gray concrete, towering shipyard cranes, and narrow, cobblestone alleys that seemed to swallow the light. It was a place of heavy industry and quiet, hardworking people who valued the safety of their routines. The social atmosphere was one of weary endurance, where the highlight of the week was a warm meal and a few hours of television. In this world, Pavel Tuchlin was invisible. He was a father of two, a husband who never raised his voice, and a worker who was never late. He was the kind of man you could stand next to on a bus for 30 minutes and never remember a single detail of his face. Tuchlin's home life in the Pomeranian countryside was a picture of socialist domesticity. He lived in a modest house with a small garden where he grew vegetables for his children. His wife saw him as a gentle provider, a man who preferred the silence of his workshop to the noise of the local tavern. He was meticulous about his tools, keeping them oiled and organized in a cellar that stayed cool even in the height of summer. But Pavel Tuchlin had a secret rhythm, a heartbeat that only accelerated when he was away from the eyes of his family. He wasn't looking for money, and he wasn't looking for fame. He was looking for a specific kind of release that only the fog could provide. The first deviation from the quiet normalcy of the city occurred in early November. A woman named Awa was walking home from her shift at a textile mill, her footsteps echoing sharply against the damp pavement. She was only 2 blocks from her apartment when she realized the street was too quiet. The usual sounds of the city, the distant clatter of a tram, the muffled voices from a nearby pub had been swallowed by a fog so thick it felt like wet wool against her skin. She increased her pace, her heart beginning a slow, heavy thrum in her chest. She didn't hear a car, and she didn't hear a shout. She only heard a single, light footstep on the dry leaves behind her. In 1977, the Polish police were not prepared for a predator like Tuchlin. They were used to crimes of passion, drunken brawls, or thefts driven by necessity. They were not looking for a man who stalked his victims for hours, learning the exact timing of their breathing and the rhythm of their walk. Tuchlin would follow a woman from the factory gates, staying exactly 40 paces behind, move for move, like a shadow that had gained its own agency. He didn't use a knife or a gun. He carried a small, heavy carpenter's hammer, the wooden handle wrapped carefully in a soft cloth. He called it his lucky charm. To him, it wasn't a tool, it was an extension of his own hand. The pressure in the city of Gdańsk began to build as the attacks continued. They called him Scorpion because of the way he seemed to strike from nowhere and then vanish back into the cracks of the city. A curfew was unofficially established by the women of the district. No one walked alone. The sound of a hammer hitting a nail in a construction site was enough to make an entire block of people stop and look over their shoulders. The police increased their patrols, but they were looking for a monster, someone with wild eyes and blood-stained clothes. They were not looking for Pavel Tuchlin, who was currently sitting at his kitchen table, helping his daughter with her mathematics homework. The point of no return for the investigation came during a particularly cold stretch of December. Tuchlin had found a new route near a park that many women used as a shortcut. He stood in the shadows of a large oak tree, the hammer heavy in his coat pocket. He watched a woman enter the park, her head tucked into her collar against the wind. He stepped out onto the path, his boots making almost no sound on the frozen dirt. He felt a sudden, sharp clarity, a sense that the world had narrowed down to just him and the rhythmic sway of her coat. He wasn't thinking about the violence, he was thinking about the control. He was the only person in the world who knew what was about to happen. The path through the trees was narrow, the branches overhead interlocking like the ribs of a giant cage. The fog moved between the trunks in slow, ghostly ribbons, distorting the sense of distance. Every sound was amplified and then immediately cut off by the damp air. The smell of rotting leaves was thick and cloying, a scent of decay that seemed to rise from the very earth. The light from the distant street lamps was a dim, orange blur that provided no comfort. The space was closing in, the trees feeling like they were leaning toward the center of the path, narrowing the world until there was no room left to breathe. It was a place where logic had no weight and only the senses remained. The sound of the Baltic wind through the overhead branches was a low, guttural moan that never stopped. It acted on the body like a physical pressure, making the inner ears ring and the balance falter. Beneath that sound, there was the sharp, dry snap of a twig. The woman stopped. She turned her head, her eyes wide, searching the gray blur of the fog. She couldn't see him, but she could feel the displacement of the air as he moved toward her. It was a vibration in the spine, a sudden chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. The sound of her own heartbeat was a frantic, irregular drum in her ears, drowning out the world until there was only the sound of a soft, cloth-wrapped thud. Tuklin stood over her for a moment, his breathing calm and even. He felt a profound sense of peace, a relief of the internal pressure that had been building for weeks. He thought to himself, "Now I can go home and sleep." It was a thought of terrifying normalcy, a mundane conclusion to a horrific act. He didn't linger. He didn't take her purse or her jewelry. He simply turned and walked back toward the street, merging with the shadows of the shipyard, workers heading for the night shift. By the time he reached his front door, he had wiped the hammer clean and tucked it back into its hidden compartment in the cellar. He was just a father returning home late from a long day at the docks. The consequences of the Scorpion spree were a massive, multi-year manhunt that eventually involved over 100 detectives. The Polish authorities, under immense pressure from a terrified public, began a systematic check of every registered worker in the Pomerania region. But Tuklin stayed a step ahead for 6 years. He was finally caught in 1983, not through a brilliant piece of detective work, but through a random document check. When the police searched his home, they expected to find a den of horrors. Instead, they found a clean, well-maintained family house. It wasn't until they moved a heavy workbench in the cellar that they found the hidden space containing the victim's belongings and the cloth-wrapped hammer. Paweł Tuklin was executed in 1987, but the meaning of his crimes left a permanent scar on the Polish psyche. He wasn't a monster from a fairy tale, he was the man who lived next door. He proved that evil doesn't always have a face that is easy to recognize. The trial revealed that he had murdered at least 9 women and attacked many more, all while maintaining the facade of a gentle family man. The Lucky Charm hammer was placed in a criminology museum, a small, mundane object that holds the weight of a decade of terror. It serves as a reminder that the most dangerous predators are the ones who understand the value of a quiet life and a clean pair of hands. The after effect of the Scorpion is a lingering, quiet dread that still settles over Gdańsk when the Baltic fog rolls in. It is the reason that people still walk a little faster when they hear a footstep behind them in a quiet park. The fear doesn't come from the hammer, but from the realization that you can never truly know the person standing next to you at the sink. Tuklin didn't just take lives, he took the community's belief in the safety of the average man. He left behind a city of people who know that the most terrifying secrets are often hidden in the most ordinary places, buried beneath the floorboards of a workshop where everything looks perfectly normal. A hammer is a tool of construction, but in a Soviet garage, the tool of choice was a weapon built by hand, from the Baltic coast of Poland. We moved deep into the heart of the Moscow Oblast, where the industrial silence of a car garage hid a secret even more claustrophobic. In the suburbs of Ivantayevka, the smell of motor oil and cold dirt provided the backdrop for a predator who didn't just stalk his victims, but brought them into a world beneath the ground, a place where the sound of the world above was replaced by the acrid scent of gunpowder. Alexander Labutkin adjusted the heavy, oil-slicked lug nut on the front wheel of his Zhiguli, the cold iron of the wrench biting into the palm of his hand. It was an afternoon in 1973, and the air inside his private garage in Ivantayevka was thick with the scent of gasoline and old rubber. He moved with a slow, mechanical precision, his breathing steady and shallow. He wiped a streak of dark grease across his overalls and listened to the distant, muffled sounds of the Moscow suburbs. Everything in his garage had a place, and every tool was a secret. He was a man who lived in the quiet corners of the world, and he understood that the best way to hide a monster was to make it look like a neighbor. Labutkin was a man who lived a life of unremarkable stillness. To his neighbors, he was just another worker in the industrial belt surrounding Moscow, a man who kept his yard clean and his head down. He was respected for his ability to fix almost anything, a skill that was invaluable in a society where new parts were a luxury. But inside, he was a hollow space. He felt a profound sense of powerlessness that he could only alleviate by exercising absolute control over the life and death of others. He viewed the people around him not as fellow citizens, but as obstacles or opportunities. He was 32 years old, and he had already decided that the world owed him something for his invisibility. In the back corner of his workbench, hidden behind a stack of rusted oil filters, lay his most prized possession. It was a homemade handgun, crafted from scrap metal and stolen industrial parts. It was a crude, ugly thing, but it was functional. He had spent months perfecting the firing mechanism, testing the spring tension in the silence of his cellar. The weapon didn't have the grace of a factory-made pistol, but it had a heavy, violent reliability. When he held it, the weight of the steel felt like an extension of his own will, a tool designed to bridge the gap between his insignificance and his desire for dominance. He could feel the cold metal vibrating with a potential energy that mirrored his own. His first strike happened in the woods on the outskirts of the town. He had been walking for hours, dressed in his heavy hunter's jacket, moving through the birches with the silence of someone who didn't exist. He spotted a young couple sitting on a fallen log, their laughter a bright, discordant sound in the gray stillness of the afternoon. They were happy, and their happiness was an insult to him. He didn't hesitate. He stepped out from behind a tree, the homemade pistol raised. The sound of the shot was a sudden, dry snap that echoed through the trees, a sound so sharp it made the inner ears ring and the teeth ache with the sudden displacement of the air. The girl died instantly. The boy didn't have time to scream. Labutkin stood over them, the acrid smell of burnt gunpowder filling his lungs, thick and metallic. He didn't feel remorse. He felt a sudden, exhilarating clarity. He moved with a practiced efficiency, reaching down to strip them of their meager belongings. He took a gold wedding band, a small handful of rubles, and a wristwatch that was still ticking against the boy's cooling skin. To Labutkin, these items were not just loot. They were trophies, physical proof that he had reached out and taken something from the world. He tucked the items into his pocket and walked back toward his garage, merging with the shadows of the evening. When he returned home, his wife was waiting for him. She was a woman who shared his hollow space, a person who found a dark comfort in his violence. She didn't ask where he had been or why his jacket smelled of the woods and smoke. Instead, she helped him clean the stolen jewelry, her fingers moving with the same methodical precision as his own. She was his accomplice in every sense of the word, the person who made the crimes feel like a domestic chore. They lived a life of quiet, shared secrets, a husband and wife who spent their evenings counting the rubles of the dead. They were a normal Soviet family, And that was the most terrifying thing about them. Over the next 3 years, the body count in the Moscow Oblast began to rise. At least 12 people vanished or were found dead in the woods, their bodies stripped of anything of value. The Soviet police, the militia, were under immense pressure to find the killer. But they were hindered by the regime's refusal to admit that such a predator could exist in their society. They looked for outsiders, for drifters, for anyone who didn't fit the mold of a productive citizen. They didn't look for the man who fixed their cars or the woman who sold them bread. Lebutkin continued to move through the suburbs with a terrifying freedom, his homemade gun a constant weight against his hip. The pressure in the town of Ivantayevka became a physical presence. People stopped walking in the woods, and the local car garages were locked tight before the sun even hit the horizon. The sound of a car backfiring or a heavy door slamming shut was enough to make a person's heart stop. The fear wasn't a loud, frantic thing. It was a slow, grinding weight that settled into the spine and made the breath come in shallow gasps. The residents felt as though the very air was closing in on them, as if the shadows between the apartment blocks had grown longer and more permanent. They were being hunted by a man who knew their names and their habits, a man who was always just a few feet away. Lebutkin's most chilling innovation was the cellar beneath his garage floor. It was a space he had dug out by hand, a narrow, low-ceiling bunker that was accessible only through a hidden hatch beneath his workbench. The air down there was stagnant, smelling of damp earth and the heavy, cloying scent of motor oil that leaked through the floorboards above. The ceiling was so low that he had to move in a constant, painful crouch. The pressure of the earth above acting on his lungs and making his heartbeat sound like a drum in the absolute silence. This was his true home, the place where he kept his weapon and the things he had taken from the people who no longer existed. The physical pressure of the cellar was a ritual for him. He would spend hours down there in the dark, the only light coming from a small, battery-powered lantern. He would hold his homemade pistol and listen to the muffled footsteps of people walking on the sidewalk outside his garage. He thought to himself, "The world is so much quieter when nobody knows where you are." It was a thought of absolute, terrifying isolation. He felt that by being beneath the ground, he was already ahead of everyone else. A ghost who was merely visiting the surface to collect what was his. The sound of his own breathing in that small space was a heavy, rhythmic pressure that felt like it was trying to push the air back out of his chest. One evening in 1975, a local woman named Elena was walking past the garage on her way home from the grocery store. The sun was setting, and the air was cooling rapidly. She heard a sound coming from inside the garage, a rhythmic, metallic tapping that seemed to be coming from beneath the floor. She stopped, her head tilted to listen. The sound stopped immediately. The silence that followed was so absolute it felt like a physical weight against her inner ears. She felt a sudden, sharp vibration in her spine, a sense that someone was looking at her through the cracks in the wooden door. She didn't run. She walked away with a forced, unnatural calm, her feet feeling heavy and slow on the pavement. She reported the sound to the local militia, and for the first time, the investigators began to look at the man in the garage. They didn't have enough evidence for an arrest, but they began to watch him. They saw the way he moved, the way he and his wife interacted with the neighbors, and they saw the absolute, clinical normalcy of his life. They began to realize that they weren't looking for a madman, they were looking for a craftsman. The pressure on Lebutkin began to build as he noticed the unmarked cars idling at the end of his street. But instead of stopping, he became more reckless, driven by a need to prove that he was still the one in control. The golden point of the investigation came when a team of officers raided the garage while Lebutkin was at work. They moved through the space with a frantic energy, tearing apart the stacks of tires and the bins of spare parts. It wasn't until a young sergeant tripped over a loose floorboard beneath the workbench that they found the hatch. As they pulled it open, the smell that rose from the darkness was so thick and foul it made their eyes water. It was the scent of rotting fabric, old blood, and the metallic tang of gunpowder. They climbed down into the narrow, damp space and found themselves in the belly of the beast. The cellar was filled with the debris of 12 lives. There were shoes, eyeglasses, handbags, and pieces of jewelry, all neatly sorted and placed in small wooden boxes. In the center of the room, resting on a pedestal made of bricks, was the homemade pistol. The officers felt the weight of the space closing in on them, the low ceiling and the damp walls acting like a physical pressure that made it hard to think. They realized that this wasn't just a hiding place. It was a temple to the act of removal. They moved through the items with a quiet, somber reverence. The silence of the cellar now filled with the realization of the scale of the horror they had uncovered. Lebutkin was arrested at his factory job an hour later. He didn't resist. He walked out to the police car with the same slow, mechanical gait he had used for years. His wife was taken into custody at their home, her face a mask of cold, unblinking indifference. The trial that followed was a shocking revelation for the Soviet public. The state was forced to admit that a serial killer of extreme brutality had been operating in the heart of the Moscow Oblast for years. The evidence was overwhelming: the stolen items, the hidden bunker, and the ballistics from the homemade gun all pointed to a man who had killed for the sheer sake of exercising his will over others. During the trial, Lebutkin spoke with a calm, detached voice, describing his crimes as if they were technical problems he had successfully solved. He showed no remorse and no emotion, even when the families of the victims were in the room. He seemed more interested in the mechanics of his homemade pistol than in the lives he had taken with it. He viewed his impending execution not as a punishment, but as the logical conclusion to his work. He was sentenced to death by firing squad, a sentence that was carried out in 1976. His wife was sentenced to a long term in a labor camp, a shadow of the man she had helped to create. The consequences of the Sashka Killer were a permanent shift in how the Soviet authorities handled violent crime. The case led to the creation of more specialized investigative units and a begrudging acknowledgement that the socialist utopia could still produce monsters. The files on the case remained classified for decades, only being opened to the public in the early 21st century. They revealed a level of cruelty and calculation that had been hidden from the world for 40 years. The true number of his victims remains a subject of debate among historians, with some suggesting that he may have been responsible for dozens of disappearances that were never officially solved. Stephen pulled the nylon lace of his left hiking boot tight, the serrated edge of the cord biting into the skin of his pinky finger with a sharp, familiar pressure. He looped it twice, tied a firm double knot, and stood up on the gravel of the Lookout parking lot. It was approximately 2 o'clock on the afternoon of August 25th, 1976. Behind him, the city of Wellington was spread out like a collection of toy houses, the gray waters of the harbor churning under a brisk, salty wind that carried the scent of wet pine and distant Cook Strait. He looked over at Michelle, who was zipped into a thick, mustard yellow jacket, her hair whipping across her face in the breeze. She smiled, shielded her eyes from the pale winter sun, and nodded toward the trail. They weren't planning a marathon, they were just going for a walk on Mount Victoria, a place that felt more like a backyard than a wilderness. Michelle Pope was 20 years old, and Stephen Dempsey was 21. They were the kind of couple that seemed to move in a shared, quiet orbit. Two students who found comfort in the simple, predictable rhythms of their life together. Michelle was organized and thoughtful, a girl who kept a diary and never missed a lecture. Stephen was more easygoing, a young man who loved the outdoors and the way the New Zealand landscape could shift from urban to rugged in the span of a few miles. To them, Mount Victoria was a sanctuary, a green lung in the middle of the capital where you could escape the noise of the university and the pressure of exams. They were vibrant, healthy, and entirely convinced of their own safety. They believed that because they could see the city lights through the trees, they were still within the reach of the civilized world. The walk began with the cheerful, rhythmic crunch of gravel under their boots. The trail led away from the paved lookout, diving into a thicket of gorse and spindly pine trees that dampened the sound of the city traffic. As they moved deeper into the scrub, the temperature dropped a few degrees, the air becoming still and smelling of damp earth and rotting needles. The bird song was loud, the frantic, complex melodies of the tui and the soft, repetitive coo of the wood pigeon. They talked about their plans for the upcoming summer, their voices low and relaxed, merging with the rustle of the wind through the overhead branches. They were moving through a landscape they had walked a dozen times before, a place where every bend in the path was as familiar as a hallway in their own homes. The first deviation from the day's quiet script occurred when they reached a high ridge overlooking the eastern suburbs. Stephen stopped to catch his breath, his eyes scanning the horizon where the mist was beginning to roll in from the sea. He felt a sudden, sharp chill that had nothing to do with the wind. The silence of the bush felt different here. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of nature, but a heavy, expectant stillness, as if the mountain itself were holding its breath. He looked back at the trail they had just climbed, expecting to see another hiker or perhaps a dog walker. But the path was empty. He thought to himself, "The air feels too heavy for a Tuesday afternoon." It was a fleeting, instinctive thought that he immediately dismissed as a trick of the altitude and the cooling air. By 6 o'clock that evening, the sun had vanished behind the western hills, and the green of the mountain had turned into a dark, impenetrable charcoal. Stephen's car, a modest sin, remained parked at the lookout, its windshield beginning to gather a thin layer of evening dew. Inside the city, Michelle's parents checked the clock. They knew their daughter was punctual, a girl who understood that a missed dinner was a cause for alarm. By 8 o'clock, the alarm had turned into a frantic, heart-pounding panic. They called Stephen's flat. Then the police. The response was immediate. Mount Victoria was not a remote mountain range. It was a public park in the center of the capital. People did not simply vanish there. The search that followed was one of the largest in the history of Wellington. For days, the hills were filled with the orange jackets of search and rescue teams and the low, rhythmic beat of helicopters. They moved in lines through the thick gorse, their sticks poking into every depression and every hollow log. They found nothing. No clothing, no footprints, and no sign of a struggle. Stephen's car was searched, but it offered no clues. His keys and wallet were gone, presumably on his person. The city was gripped by a collective, growing dread. How could two young people walk into a suburban park in broad daylight and disappear as if they had stepped into another dimension? The pressure on the community became a physical thing, a weight that made every parent in Wellington keep their children inside as the sun went down. For the next 10 years, Mount Victoria became a place of ghosts. The case of Michelle and Stephen was a permanent, open wound in the psyche of New Zealand. Every few months, a new theory would surface: a secret runaway pact, a political kidnapping, or a freak accident involving a hidden mineshaft. But as the years turned into a decade, the silence of the mountain remained absolute. The families of the victims lived in a state of suspended animation, their lives defined by the absence of their children. The bush on the mountain grew thicker, the trails shifted, and the city below continued to grow. But the mystery of 1976 stayed frozen in time, a dark secret buried beneath the green canopy. The point of no return arrived on a crisp afternoon in 1986. A hiker, moving off the main trail in search of a better view of the harbor, pushed through a thick stand of manuka trees in a remote gully. He stopped when he saw something white reflecting the sunlight through the leaves. He stepped closer, thinking it was a discarded piece of plastic or a bleached branch. But as he cleared the brush, he felt a sudden, sharp vibration in his spine that made his inner ears ring. Lying side by side in the dirt were two human skeletons. They were positioned neatly, their arms seemingly at their sides, as if they had simply lain down to sleep a decade ago and never woken up. The hiker didn't move. He stood in the absolute silence of the gully, the sound of his own heartbeat, a frantic, irregular drum in his ears. The police arrived with a specialized forensic team, As they carefully brushed away 10 years of leaf litter and soil, the true horror of the scene began to emerge. This was not an accident, and it was not a voluntary disappearance. Both skulls had small, circular entry wounds, and bullet fragments were found lodged deep within the rib cages. The victims had been sniped. Someone had stood at a distance, perhaps on a higher ridge, and picked them off with a high-powered rifle as they walked. But the most unsettling detail was the staging. The bodies had been moved after death, arranged in a way that suggested the killer had spent time with them, carefully placing them in this final, mock peaceful pose. It was the work of a hunter who viewed his victims not as people, but as trophies to be displayed in a private gallery of the dead. Imagine you are standing in that narrow gully. The trees are so thick overhead that the light is a dim, greenish gray, and the air is stagnant, smelling of wet wool and ancient, rotted wood. You can hear the city far below the faint honk of a horn, the hum of a bus, but here, the silence is a physical pressure that acts on your lungs, making every breath feel like a struggle. You realize that you are in a place where the normal rules of the world don't apply. You are in a theater of the macabre. And the person who created this scene was watching the ridge just as you are now. You feel a sudden, sharp coldness in the pit of your stomach, a sense that the space around you is narrowing, the trees closing in, and that there is no way back to the safety of the trail. In that moment of absolute, bone-deep terror, as the hiker realized what he was looking at, a single, crystalline thought flared up in his mind. I hope he isn't still watching. It was a thought born of pure, animal instinct, a realization that the mountain was not empty. He looked up at the surrounding ridges, his eyes darting from shadow to shadow, every rustle of a leaf sounding like the click of a safety being disengaged. He felt the weight of the crosshairs in his very marrow, a phantom pressure that made his spine go rigid. He backed away from the remains, his boots making a deafening, clumsy sound on the dry brush, until he reached the safety of the main path. He didn't look back until he could see the houses of the suburbs. The investigation into the hunter of Mount Victoria led the police to a man named David Tamahir. Tamahir was a man with a history of violence and a deep knowledge of the New Zealand bush. He had been in the area at the time of the disappearance, and in 1991, he was convicted of the murders based on a combination of circumstantial evidence and the testimony of jailhouse informants. He was sentenced to life in prison, but the case remained a subject of intense controversy. Tamahir always maintained his innocence, claiming he had been a convenient scapegoat for a police department desperate to close a decade-old case. The staged nature of the crime scene and the precision of the shooting suggested a level of skill and psychological complexity that some believed didn't fit the man in the dock. The consequences of the conviction were a country divided. For some, it was the final, necessary closure to a nightmare that had lasted 15 years. For others, it was a secondary tragedy, a potential miscarriage of justice that left the real hunter still at large. Tamahir spent 20 years behind bars before being paroled, but he never stopped fighting to clear his name. The case became a staple of New Zealand crime podcasts and documentaries, a story that refused to stay buried. It exposed the flaws in the judicial system and the desperate need for a society to find an answer. Even if the answer was incomplete, the mountain had given up the bodies, but it had held on to the truth with a stubborn, cold grip. The after effect of the Mount Victoria murders is a quiet, lingering investigative dread that still haunts the city of Wellington. It is the reason that hikers on those green hills will sometimes stop and look over their shoulders, certain that a pair of eyes is watching them from the higher scrub. The fear doesn't come from the ghost of the victims, but from the shadow of the hunter. It is the realization that the most beautiful, peaceful landscapes can be turned into a killing floor by a man with a rifle and a steady hand. The mountain remains a popular recreation spot, but for those who remember 1976, the birdsong always sounds a little too quiet, and the wind through the pines always sounds a little too much like a sigh. That was the final story in our sequence tonight. 13 cases from across the world that show us how the line between the normal and the nightmare is thinner than we like to think. Whether it's a locked bathroom in Malaysia, a desert convoy in the Sahara, or a quiet walk on a New Zealand hill, the danger is rarely where we expect it to be. It is often right in front of us, hidden in the mundane details of our everyday lives. As you go about your week, pay attention to the small sounds, the scratch on the door, the whistle of the wind, the footstep behind you in the fog, because sometimes the most terrifying thing isn't what we don't know. It's what we choose not to see. Thank you for listening, and stay safe. As we sit here at the end of these 13 accounts, there is a specific kind of silence that begins to settle into the room. It is not a peaceful silence, but a heavy, vibrating stillness that makes you want to check the locks on your own windows. We have traveled from the humid corridors of Malaysia to the frozen heights of the Himalayas, and yet the fear does not come from the distance. It comes from how close these stories feel to our own lives. The most unsettling thing about the disappearance of Ahmad Sairif in 1976 is not that he vanished, but that he did so while surrounded by 50 people who loved him. We often think of danger as something that happens in dark alleys or abandoned houses. But for Ahmad, the threat materialized in a locked bathroom in the middle of a wedding celebration. It forces us to ask how a person can simply slip through the very fabric of a crowded, joyful day. When we think of the geologists in the Sahara, the image that lingers is not the vastness of the desert, but the open jar of jam on the folding table. That one small, domestic detail tells us everything we need to know about the speed of the removal. They didn't run, and they didn't hide. They were in the middle of a mundane act of survival when the world simply opened up and swallowed them. It is the normalcy of the scene that makes the vacuum of their absence so loud. In Pretoria, the fear was carved directly into the wood of the front door. The Pretoria Axeman understood that the greatest psychological blow is not the violence itself, but the realization that your sanctuary has been marked. To wake up and find an X on your door is to realize that a predator has stood inches away from your sleeping head, measuring your life with a blade. It turns the home from a place of rest into a countdown where the intruder already knows the layout. Marie Agnes Zachary left behind a pink floral dress that was cleaner than the day she vanished. That detail is perhaps the most haunting of all, because it suggests a predator who was not chaotic, but terrifyingly orderly. It implies a person who took the time to iron a child's garment before returning it to the riverbank. This kind of calculated ritualism tells us that we are not dealing with a monster of impulse, but a man who views his crimes as a series of precise, finished tasks. The two explorers in the Himalayas didn't leave their boots behind because they were forgetful. In the world of high-altitude climbing, your boots are your only connection to the earth. To find them neatly lined up in a tent at 20,000 feet is to see a total surrender of the will to survive. It leaves us wondering what could be so terrifying that a seasoned professional would choose to step out into a 40 below zero night in his stocking feet, heading toward the mist. The Monster of Udine reminds us that the hands we are taught to trust can also be the hands that hold the scalpel. The clinical precision of the shaped incision is a signature of a mind that has completely detached itself from human empathy. It suggests that, to some, a person is just a collection of anatomical parts to be opened and studied. This betrayal of the healer's role creates a lasting distrust that settles into the bones of a community and never truly leaves. Claudia Lesson Rodriguez was a victim of a system where wealth acted as a physical barrier against the truth. The roar of the Atlantic at the base of the Niemeyer Cliffs is a sound that now carries the weight of a cover-up. It is a reminder that power can silence a scream just as effectively as the waves. The tragedy is not just her death, but the way the world moved on as if she were a liability to be discarded, proving that sometimes the law is just another tool for the elite. Comfort Owusu stepped out of her silver shoes and into a void that has lasted for 50 years. The image of those shoes sitting by the bandstand while the high-life music played on is a perfect metaphor for the fragility of fame and beauty. One moment, she was the center of a crowded room, and the next, she was a ghost, It leaves a lingering question about the people in the shadows of the VIP section. The ones who watch from behind tinted glass while the rest of the world dances. Marta Reyes left a blank piece of paper in her blazer pocket, a message that serves as a tombstone for an entire era of paranoia in Santiago. In a world where every word could be a crime, a blank page is the ultimate statement of erasure. It reflects a life that was lived according to the rules, only to be ended by a predator who used the state's own silence as a shield. Her blazer on the bench is a quiet, navy blue testament to the fact that no one is truly invisible to a hunter. The suitcase on the bus in Bucharest represents the ultimate failure of a society to protect its own. To see an innocent man like Gheorghe Samoilescu broken by the very system meant to find justice is a horror that stays in the gut. While he was being tortured, the real killer was continuing his work, emboldened by the state's incompetence. It teaches us that the pursuit of a quick answer is often more dangerous than the mystery itself, leaving behind only ruined lives. Paweł Tuchlin, the Scorpion of Gdańsk, was the man who walked his children to school and fixed the garden fence. His normalcy was his most effective weapon. It is the realization that a family man can hide a hammer in his cellar that makes us look at our own neighbors differently. He didn't have a monstrous face, he had a gentle one. This camouflage of the mundane is what allows evil to thrive in the heart of a community, hidden behind the curtains of a well-kept home. Alexander Lebutkin's garage cellar was a space where the world of the living was only a few inches of wood away. To think of him sitting in the dark beneath his workbench, listening to the footsteps of people on the sidewalk, is to understand the true nature of the predator. He didn't need to travel far to find his victims. He brought the darkness to them. The smell of motor oil and the sound of a closing hatch become the sensory markers of a trap that was built by a neighbor. The hunter of Mount Victoria turned a public park into a gallery of the dead. The fact that the bodies were staged to look like they were sleeping is a chilling insight into a mind that viewed murder as a form of art. It suggests a killer who returned to the scene to admire his work. A man who felt a sense of ownership over the mountain and everyone on it. It leaves a lingering fear in the green hills of Wellington, a sense that every hiker is being viewed through a lens. These 13 stories are not just accounts of what happened, they are maps of human vulnerability. They show us that the things we fear the most are not the supernatural or the exaggerated, but the gaps in our own daily logic. We fear the bathroom door that doesn't open, the car that stays running, and the person who knows our name. These details are the anchors of our reality. And when they are twisted, the psychological after effect is a weight that doesn't easily lift. What lingers in the mind after the story's end is the persistent why. Why did the geologists leave the table? Why did the Axeman carve the X? We look for patterns because we want to believe that if we understand the logic of the predator, we can avoid becoming the prey. But the true lesson of these cases is that sometimes there is no logic that can save you. There is only the sudden, sharp transition from the world of the living to the world of the missing. We are left with the objects, the shoes, the dress, the blazer, the suitcase. These items are the physical echoes of the people who wore them. They serve as reminders that a life can be reduced to a single garment or a piece of leather in a matter of seconds. These objects hold a silence that is more powerful than any testimony, a stillness that demands we remember the names of the people who are no longer here to speak for themselves. The fear that comes from these stories is a survival mechanism. It is the part of the brain that tells you to look twice at the shadow in the hallway or to listen for the footstep that doesn't match your own. It is a grounded, realistic caution that recognizes that the world is a complex and sometimes predatory place. By examining these cases, we are not just seeking a thrill, we are acknowledging the risks that are inherent in the simple act of living a life. There is a finality to these stories that is difficult to process. Most of them remain unsolved, a collection of open questions that continue to vibrate in the archives of the world's police departments. They remind us that the truth is often buried beneath layers of time, sand, or political influence. But even without an answer, the stories themselves provide a form of witness. They ensure that the people who vanished are not forgotten, even if their fates are never fully known. As you turn away from these accounts and return to your own life, take a moment to appreciate the mundane safety of your surroundings. The sound of a door locking, the warmth of a meal, and the presence of the people you love are the things that keep the darkness at bay. These stories are a reminder to value the predictable rhythms of the day. Because as we have seen, those rhythms can be interrupted in the blink of an eye, leaving behind only a silence. The cumulative effect of these 13 cases is a heightened awareness of the world around us. It is the realization that the strange, dark, and mysterious is not a distant concept, but something that can happen on a Tuesday afternoon or a New Year's Eve. It is the understanding that the most terrifying things are the ones that could truly happen to anyone, anywhere. This realism is what gives the stories their power and what makes the after effects stay with us long after the night ends. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the shadows of the 1970s. It has been an exploration of the limits of human logic and the enduring power of the unknown. If these accounts have resonated with you, I invite you to subscribe to the channel and join our community of storytellers. We are constantly searching for the truth behind the world's most haunting mysteries, and your support is what allows us to keep these stories alive for the next generation. Please leave a comment below and let me know which of these 13 cases left the deepest impression on you. Was it the missing groom in Malaysia, the ghost convoy in the Sahara, or the hunter on the New Zealand hills? Hearing your perspectives helps us to understand what truly haunts the modern mind. We value your insights and your presence here, and we look forward to continuing this conversation in the episodes to come. Until next time, stay observant, stay curious, and stay safe.